Go. Okay, can I welcome you to today's meeting of the Budget and Performance Committee? Can I ask everyone, please make sure your electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any interruptions. Can I also ask the Clerk, Lauren Harvey, if there are any apologies have been received?
Thank you. Apologies have been received from the Chairman, Assemblymember Fortune, for whom Assemblymember Prince is substituting.
Okay, just before we get to our main business or the first part of our main business this morning, we've got a couple of issues that we need to deal with. Declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out in item 2 and ask if any members of other interest to declare? Okay, thank you. Moving on to item 3, summary list of actions. Can I ask the committee to note the ongoing actions from previous meetings of the committee? Thank you. And item 4, which is our main business for the first part of this meeting, we now move towards our discussion on the draft GLA group budget on police, and later on this morning we deal with fire. So can I welcome Sophie Linden, Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime, Sir Mark Rowley, QPM, Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. We welcome you to this meeting. We were very pleased to have you because normally we have your deputy, so we feel very privileged. So we even sharpened our questions up for your presence this morning. Ian Percival, Finance Director of the MPS, and Lisa Kitto, the Interim Chief Finance Officer for MOPAC. And for us, a constant presence in our budget meetings, Enver, Assistant Director and Group Finance Performance at the GLA. Okay, so we're just going to allow you to, Sophie, Mark, you don't have to, if you want to say a few opening remarks before we move into our questions, you're welcome to. So, Sophie, are you content or would you like to say something?
I'll go first then, if that's okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you for this opportunity. As you say, I won't be here every time, but it's helpful for me at the start of my commissionership to sort of have this conversation with you as we set next year's budget. I've got a big mission to do in terms of rebuilding trust, and a lot of that sits with me in terms of rearranging how we operate, improving our operational policing and all the sort of changes we've spoken about in other fora that I'm not going to detail here. A lot of that sits with me, but some of the issues in terms of reform in the Met will be helped by the right finances, which is why I wanted to come along here. So, but some of that sits with me in terms of building an efficiency programme, which we don't have a strong efficiency programme at the moment, and getting tighter on issues such as reserves and capital programme, which I know is something you've picked away at in the past, and I agree with that sentiment. But what you'll see in the papers, and the thing I wanted to mention at the start really is we haven't yet finally costed what I think we need to put into the budget in terms of reform costs, and I think that's probably a further few tens of millions. And sort of we talked about it, putting an estimate in or not, and we both agreed that it sort of, on balance, putting a very rough figure in would sort of generate more heat than it would do light. But the sort of things that are of concern to me is neighbourhood policing, we all know, is so important to public trust and confidence, and it's not as strong as it has been in the past, particularly with regard to PCSOs, amongst other things. So there's some issues there if we're going to start to rebuild that. You've heard me talk about not being as data and technology-led as a modern organisation ought to be, and there's some costs we're working up around there, much of which will be capital, but some of it which will be revenue. And then some fundamental foundational issues which, interestingly, Louise Casey started to pick up, and she hints at them in her sort of interim report, and I think she'll be clearer on them in her final report in February or March. Issues for me around leadership. Leadership, as we've discussed, is so critical to culture, and we do such little leadership training. Just to give you one comparison, a chief superintendent compared to a colonel will have had 72 weeks training after Sandhurst in leadership command courses in the military. A chief superintendent will have had little or none. He or she might have done, will have done some operational courses like commanding firearms operations, but in terms of leadership and command, quite a small amount. And sort of From sergeants upwards, I need to sort of start to repair that, and we're looking at plans on that. Personnel, we've stripped personnel back to the basics as part of trying to protect the front line over the last decade, and I was part of some of those decisions. But when you look back at it, some of those decisions in hindsight, we've gone further than has made sense. And so if you're a sergeant or inspector with a difficult personnel issue, perhaps a very underperforming officer you want to get rid of or sort of manage their performance of, the HR support around you is so distant and not able to really give you the coaching you can do to deal with something that as a leader you may be dealing with once every 2 or 3 years, and you're going to need that help. And then some basics around the basic logistics that keeps kit and buildings and things going. So some of those issues that underpin policing are critical, and that's the sort of things we're working into, say, what will be a sort of a few tens of millions of extra pressure. So I wanted to make that link between reform, my duties in terms of tightening on the efficiency in the way we do it, but also it will create a bit more of a gap that we'll have finalised over the next week or two.
Okay, thank you. Sophie.
Thanks a lot. And in addition to what Sir Mark said, it's always challenging anyway to put together the budget. I think it's particularly challenging at the moment because of what the unknowns that we have. We always have the unknowns at this stage anyway. We haven't had the police settlement. We don't know what the our flexibilities will be like in terms of precept, and also we don't know what our council tax base or the buoyancy. So it's always a little bit of a difficult conversation, this one at Budget and Performance Committee. However, we have other real challenges in terms of cost of living crisis, energy costs, inflation, unknowns around pay rises. All those are things that we are trying to juggle, and I think by February hopefully we will have a better understanding of some of them but not all of them. So it's a difficult challenging position to be in, to set a budget not just for the Metropolitan Police but for MOPAC as well. So on top of what Sir Mark said in terms of the Metropolitan Police budget, where I think there has been, and we've seen it from the auditors and from the inspectorate, there is now good financial management and good use of resources. In terms of the MOPAC budget, again, we are very clear about looking for value for money, looking for good outcomes in the evaluation of our projects and programmes, and this budget does set out how we are going to be investing in the Mayor's priority in delivering the policing crime plan, from tackling violence against women and girls, protecting the vulnerable, but also really importantly making sure that we continue the investment into the violence reduction unit and also investment into victim services. All those things are within this budget and will continue to be within the budget. And we will continue to also bear down on reserves. One of the issues that we often get picked up on at Budget Committee is around reprofiling. We're really clear that in terms of our investment in programmes and projects, we don't want to do one-off, one-year funding. So we do profile, lump sums into following years as well. So that's some of the movement that you see in the budget as well. But I'll leave that there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me kick off with probably the first question. So it's generally about, it's to you, Sophie, in terms of the question. So this year we know that MOPAC and the MPS have submitted a broadly balanced budget. In contrast to last year's submission, that had, a 249 million funding gap. So what's driven the change of the approach? Is it the timing of those meetings last year? Why is there a change in terms of direction in terms of your budget management approach this year?
Apologies, rookie error. The budget for next year is broadly balanced. It does have a £5.9 million pot of savings that needs to be found. But you're right in terms of actually the vastness of the budget. That is quite minor. So going forward, we're confident that we'll find it. In terms of why there is a difference from this year to last year, it is, as everyone around this table will know, it is a difference of, for next year, we have not put into the budget our aspiration of 6,000 officers for the Metropolitan Police. It does not mean that we have pulled back from that aspiration. It is because we know that because of the labour market, there are challenging issues around recruitment. So we are recruiting to the police uplift for next year, and we will in the following year, as you can see from the budget papers, we have the structural and the non-structural gap, with the non-structural gap being if is the aspiration around recruiting to the 6,000 officers. We still think that is necessary, as does the Commissioner, but for the next financial year we have taken a view of what is possible with the labour market in terms of recruitment.
And sorry, and that 6,000 police officers was made on a judgment. I mean, a lot was made of it at the previous commissioner, but there were arguments about that, of that's what London should be working and receiving finance on. Is that what that 6,000 figure, remind me?
Yes, that's the 6,000 figure that the previous commissioner and Sir Mark has also said that that is what the Metropolitan Police should be getting out of the police uplift programme.
So move that, because it does exercise some members of this committee, less so for some, but in terms of that, so in terms of your budgetary making of what you're presenting to this committee now is actually achievable, and in a pragmatic sense you realise that you're not going to do it because I think you referred to the market of recruitment, but also there is an element of funding, isn't there?
No, it is about it is about the ability to recruit and the challenge around the labour market, not the funding around the 6,000 for next year.
Okay, all right, thank you for that. Let's go on to Ian. So, Mark, you might want to come in on this. So, when you when do you expect the police funding formula review to be concluded? And tell us about the representations that have been made to government to argue about the London share in the new formula. So where's that been going? And have you been working, presumably been working closely with your MOPAC colleagues around that?
So it's only just been announced. I mean, clearly there have been previous funding reviews and we've worked together on those, and the latest one was just announced by the policing minister, wasn't it? We will be putting a very strong case. A couple of sort of facts that I think sort of illustrate some of the challenges in funding and funding formula. So just in terms of funding overall, if you were to go back to 2010-11, we would need £878 million more to today be able to match in real terms per head of population the funding for policing of London. So that's about 27% uplift. And that's a sort of generic point in terms of police funding. A particular issue for us is the national and international capital cities money. When I was here previously, I was involved in some work that sort of put some more shape and detail around what those costs were. That was subsequently audited by an independent auditor on behalf of the Home Office, and that sort of produces a figure that we reckon that should be north of 310 million in funding, and we currently get 180 roughly. And that's obviously quite a big deficit. And that's one of my concerns in terms of meeting the challenges in London, that if you look at the HMIC, FRS inspection reports and us being put in Engage, we are strong at issues like major events and organised crime and, of course, counter-terrorism. Most of our problems come in the day-to-day services to Londoners in terms of issues like supporting victims, etc. And frankly, I think there's a link between those two things. The sort of propping up the capital city responsibilities is to the detriment of day-to-day policing for Londoners. So that's a really critical number for me.
And in terms of the representations being made to government about that, it seems that you're talking to each other, but of course there's no movement, or is there movement?
So the funding formula has just been reviewed, has just been announced by the policing minister. As you know, we've previously made representations. We've in terms of this pending budget and the points I've already made to you about reform and the costs. We're in conversations with government about that exact issue and making the point that the underfunding of the NIC is a big factor for us in that.
Okay, all right. Okay, let's then move on. My colleagues might ask more questions about the police officer numbers and come back to you on that. I think I will leave it there and bring in Assembly Member Hall.
Okay. Are you going to ask Dee? Yeah.
I might come back to that. But
Okay.
I thought on police numbers you might want to pursue it.
Yes, I do, because you made a comment about that. I've said over the past couple of years, Sir Mark, that the problem with this was that there was the Cressida Dick was saying she wanted 5,000 extra. The mayor then said he wanted 6,000 extra, so the figure became 6,000, which led to a £250 million funding gap. And I argued the case last year financially. I'd argue for tens of thousands more police officers because I'm passionate about policing. But we have to look at what we've got. We have to look at reality and we have to look at budgets. So, I mean, if I ask you about your recruitment levels at the moment, how are you trying to attempt to boost recruitment? Because I know there's an issue at the moment.
So we're hoping to get to somewhere around 35,000 by the end of the year. It is an increasingly challenging market, and we have recruiting sort of best part of 10,000 officers, I think, in the last 3 years, with a combination of sort of replacing retirements, etc., and growing the numbers. You do start to sort of get to a stage where you've sort of almost exhausted the market, and we are going, we're taking everybody who can meet the standards, and so we're working very hard on that. It's a really challenging environment, and for us to meet our police uplift number, we won't meet exactly the number by April. It will take a few months into next year to do that, and we're in correspondence with the Home Office about that. It's one of the reasons for sort of, and then for me, I agree with Deputy Mayor in terms of we need to get to that number and stabilise the officer numbers over the course of next year, and the extra officers, which I fully agree with, which have been penciled in previously up to the 6,000, I'd like to be doing that in the following years. We have an awful lot of challenge in terms of policing London for the reasons I said earlier, in terms of that 878 million gap, and sort of having a first step of dealing with that with increased PCSOs, which I'm talking about sort of now, and also increased officers in due course, seems to me quite moderate compared to the scale of that challenge.
Okay, so are you in fact planning for these officers, i.e. the 6,000, from an operational point of view, or are you only planning in an operational way for the ones you know you've got?
I'm more planning for what we've got in place for next year. That's a desire for future years to meet some of the challenges in stretch around dealing better with victims, dealing better with volume crime, dealing better with areas like fraud, which we all know is under police. So there's a whole range of ways to deploy resources to that with those extra resources, but that's for 2024 and beyond.
Okay, so you would agree then that from a financial aspect, for dealing with budgets, it's best to deal with the reality as opposed to hypothetical police officer numbers? Well,
there's a reality about what is required. There's two realities, aren't there? There's a financial reality and a reality about what it takes to police London, and they don't always align. We as the Deputy Mayor says, we've been quite candid. We're not putting it in next year's budget, but it is still something that operationally we would like to see coming to bear in due course.
Yep, no, I understand that completely, and I share most of your comments. The thing is, do you think it's sensible to put in a budget that would accommodate a whole load of officers that you know that you're not getting? This has been my argument for the past couple of years. Everything's geared around extra officers that you know you're not going to get. This isn't so much, but that has been my argument going through. We've been putting figures in to accommodate 6,000 new officers, which we knew we were not getting.
But isn't it, so I would come at a budget in a slightly different way. I'd start saying, actually, what does it take to police London, and work on from there. And then you have to sometimes cut your ambition against the budget. If I'm understanding your question, isn't there a danger that we set the policing strategy simply based on the money that happens to be available without having a conversation about what may be needed?
Well, I would definitely say that it should be different to the way it's been before. This at least shows some reality from that point of view. Chairman, where...
So I'm going to come back, it's coming back to me. So I'm on a couple of issues here. I think we can just following up about officers going. I think we've got some written questions coming to you. I think we're going to pose to you on about assumptions and cost about retirees, and in particular about resignations within the police office, but we prefer to write that to you. I'd like to come on to about the structural deficit in terms of your budget? Oh, sorry, on police numbers. Yes, please.
Just to try and keep with this theme. First of all, just picking up on the police funding formula review. Just what's the timescale for that? I'd obviously missed this policing minister's announcement. What's the sort of timescale?
I literally got a letter yesterday and I skimmed it and I can't remember the timescale for it. But my sense was he really wanted to get on with it. I can't remember if he put a timescale.
Probably for the next financial year rather than.
It wasn't for 23-24.
Yeah. Okay. That's helpful. At least I'm relieved I haven't completely missed it. If it was only yesterday that came out. Just to clarify on the police numbers, because in your budget submission you state, and you've touched on it earlier, but I just want to get this clearly on record, that you have informed the Home Office that you will be approximately 400 below target under the police uplift programme, which means that your Home Office grant will be reduced by 21.5 million. So you've got this huge ambition, but you just can't recruit. Now, some of it you're saying is difficulty with the pool. Is part of that because the Met's reputation has been dented recently? People think, I don't want to go there. Is it that you need to start looking at your shift patterns and other things to make it more attractive for people to come in? What is the issue here? Because you're sending back money to the Home Office. Which
really hurts. I completely, I share the sentiment behind the question. So, to get all the police uplift programme money, we needed to get to around 35,400 by the end of the financial year, so the 1st of April, and we think we're going to get close to 35,000. Of course, it's changing on a regular basis. Some of this is about attrition out. Some of this is about the difficult recruitment market coming in. We've got some research going on at the moment on the attrition, just to get more under the skin of service length, reasons, etc. We have seen some changes in recent years where, because police officers have to work longer to retirement, have to make bigger contributions to pensions are less generous, that people are retiring at different points in the service in a way they didn't used to. But also I'm seeing some anecdotal evidence that the pressures on frontline officers and the challenges they're facing at the moment is affecting people quite early in their career as well. So we're getting underneath that to understand it. It's a challenge recruiting this many people in London. I don't deny it. Is the reputation issue a factor? I haven't seen any evidence of that yet, but the work we're doing, looking back at exit interviews, etc., will give us an answer. So perhaps in terms of the letter the Chair mentioned, when we give you that, in the next couple of weeks, we'll be able to give you the next update in terms of data. We'll also be able to tell you what that research is showing as the causes.
Right, okay, and you may want to be thinking about how the roles are structured, as I say, shift patterns and so on, so you can attract a more diverse range of people if you're finding your pool is restricted at the moment. Thank you.
Okay, so can we just return to the budget, the structural deficit within your budget in terms of that? So I think you've got, and this may well be to Ian, I don't know, but I don't mind who answers it, as long as I get an answer. So you state there's a structural deficit of 189 million for 24/25 and 25-26 years. So in terms of the plans to address the deficit, were they what Sir Mark earlier referred to as partly some of his efficiency plans that was there? Give us can you paint some pictures for the committee?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, we have we've just about balanced the budget for next year, but then we do, and you will note that we're using reserves as part of that to balance the budget, which does mean that we have got deficits going forward. Yes, part of the challenge, as Sir Mark said, will be that we need to implement an efficiency programme in order to drive down our costs, make sure we are using basically every penny as the best way that we can, and it will be through that efficiency programme that we will look to drive down costs and balance the budget.
And when do we think we'll have the plan?
We're just firing up the efficiency programme at the moment, so it's a few months away, frankly, to build up the plans. The sort of things we've done. It seems to me there's been a lot of salami slicing. but we haven't done as much targeted efficiency work as we could do. So things like automation, we have quite a lot of fairly mandrolic sort of computer-based processes, which you could see you could make some efficiencies in with the right investment. So I can see some scope for making efficiencies. Of course, it's not going to balance the budget entirely, because if you start from the premise that you're not reducing the number of police officers or the number of PCSOs, that takes out 35 or 40% of the budget immediately. So your addressable spend is the minority of the budget, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be going after efficiencies in that, and of course we will be. So some of the gaps can be addressed by efficiencies, but not all of it.
But do you not think it's right? I mean, I can't remember the last really major drive that you've had within the MPS around efficiencies. Do you not think, terrible phrase, back to basics of reviewing everything, isn't it? I mean, I used to think more police officers would mean less overtime, but that's not the case, is it? So, simple soul that I am, how do you get back into driving those about efficient practices and about some time worn out practices that exist because they exist? What's the outcome do I get for it? I'm a great believer in overtime as a crime fighting tool. Don't get me wrong, I'm not one of those who says don't do it, but there's an outcome to it, isn't it? If I give you extra 6 hours, I should see an outcome. So
I completely agree with the sentiment behind that. I think there's two types of efficiencies, aren't there? So there's how we deploy. If we're working on the basis we're not going to reduce the number of PCs and PCSOs, how do we deploy them to best effect? So it might not be cashable generally, but you out of the same resources, you're having a better effect for London, which must be right. And some of our efficiency work needs to do that. But likewise, there's some of the middle office and back office functions where through better investment in technology, streamlining processes, becoming less bureaucratic, frankly, you can take real cost out. So it's a combination of the two, the sort of the cashable and the non-cashable. And so we've got to build a programme and get the capability in and start to work our way through that to produce. It's not going to produce those sort of programmes. You don't fire them up in a month or two, so it's not going to produce massive savings next year, but we should be sort of making significant tens of millions of savings in 24, 25, 26.
Okay. Can you just give a flavour to the committee what our one-off expenditure, big expenditure, impacts on your budgets? So Operation London Bridge is a one-off. It's not. Hopefully, it's a one-off. The question then is, how does that impact on your budget when you've got a number of those? So you could say a combination of London Bridge with climate change protests to X, Y, Z. Just give us a flavour of what is the reality of that impact, or you take it on the chin and you carry on and keep doing the job. Can you just tell us in the dynamics of your budget what that means?
So there's a general principle which for the Home Office to help out on special events tends to be set, I think, at 1% is my recollection, about 1% of budget, which doesn't always work favourably to a bigger organisation, of course. But there's some sense that you ought to be able to absorb some shocks on the system, which is not an unreasonable principle. Something like London Bridge, which will be sort of many, many tens of millions, we're still finalising the costs in conversation in the Home Office. We would absolutely expect it's 100% sort of reimbursed, and sort of we're not seeing any signs from the Home Office they're going to go away from normal practice in that regard. So something like that is a massive operational disruption to the organisation, but is not a financial disruption in the longer term. A change in demand profile of something a bit more routine, like JSO and all the protest work, which has been taking many, many officers out of local policing into centre of London and the M25 and all the rest of it, and all the things you've seen in the papers, that's the sort of thing we have to absorb. And it has some cost implication, maybe with overtime, but the bigger cost is really the disruptive cost of displacing resources from day-to-day policing activity, serving Londoners, through to dealing with the annoyingly disruptive protesters that we've been facing.
And is that becoming the norm? in the sense of your future predictions of workloads around that of these type of protests in the coming years? Are you factoring that in, that, you know, not just as and when it occurs, that actually this is the nature of demonstrations that are likely to take place here in the capital?
So absolutely, and I think if this plays back into where we started the conversation around capital cities grants, there are a range of factors in that we've looked at that are disproportionate demand in London. Disproportionate amount of organised crime is another dimension, but the protest issue, of course, people protest in the capital city. That's for all sorts of obvious reasons. In a way, they don't protest in Birmingham or Manchester. It's not a proportionate equation. It's very, very different. And so those are the factors in there. So the cost of the resourcing cost in terms of the full resourcing cost of there's a couple of hundred officer days dealing with a big protest. The full resourcing cost of that is the sort of things that have been taken into account in that figure that's, say, north of 300 million in terms of the capital cities grant that is underfunded by at least 130 million. So that's the concern. If we had that properly funded, we could organise our resources accordingly. There's always a balance between how much do you build in central teams like the TSG who can be dedicated to that work versus how much do you build flexibility with local officers occasionally abstracted, and we'll constantly review that balance. But the principle about it being funded is really important, and that's why the capital cities grant is so concerning to me.
Okay, so
Chair, can I just pick up on one thing that Sir Mark said, because I think it's really important in terms of the budgeting and your really important question about that burden, that because it's capital city and there's the capital city grant, but also that figure of 1%, that in order to get the special grant from government you have to have a expenditure on whatever event of 1% of your budget. It really penalises the Metropolitan Police. We had it confirmed with us from the previous policing minister, Kit Malthouse, that was not going to change, and that actually the Home Office was going to get stricter in the application of that 1%. It's a real issue for the Met because there aren't many events that get you to 1% of the Metropolitan Police budget, but there are lots of events that actually do create a financial burden.
And no doubt you're recording that, cataloguing it to make the future representations around on that. I mean, this may be all something for Police and Crime Committee to pick up on, but I think we might be picking up on it in terms of impacting on budgetary issues of how it does and when it does become the normal. It's almost like it now. Okay, let's move. I'm looking to colleagues now. Is there any more on this section that people want to ask?
And just before I go on to that, maybe it'd be worth talking to Chris Philp about it. Sophie, what do you think is the Mayor's current thinking about the policing precept?
He is, as I said at the beginning, there's so many unknowns at the moment that he is waiting to see, as he always does, what the police settlement is, what the allocation for London will be, and also what the council tax and buoyancy will be before he makes a decision on the police precept.
Okay, it's just that he's maximised it every year, hasn't he? Given the situation with the cost of living, etc. I'm just wondering whether he could look to subsidise, if you like, the police more out of his own budget. I know he's paying for the 1,300 officers, but given that he can find that funding, I was wondering whether he would be prepared to put more money in there.
As you know, I mean, as you've just referenced, there's 1,300 additional officers in the Met because of the Mayor's funding. I mean, the Mayor will it's a difficult decision because of the cost of living crisis, and at the moment we don't know what the full picture is for the budget. The Mayor doesn't know that. He will take that decision when that is clear, what London is getting from the policing settlement and what council tax and buoyancy looks like. He'll make that decision.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, good morning, panel. If I could ask you, Ian, the budget assumes a pay increase of 2.5%. How realistic is this?
Well, we've based the assessment on our previous submission that went into the police pay and remuneration body. So we'd made representations on a 3-year settlement, which was 3.5% this year, 2.5% next year, and 2% the year after. So that's what our budget is. That's what our budget is built on. In terms of realism, it's it's our professional judgment at the moment. There is of course risk if pay inflation increases, but then there's also talk potentially, if you read the papers, around public sector pay restraints. So we feel it's a reasonable assumption where we are at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, shall we move on to section 2, growth proposals, over to Assembly Member Pigeon.
Lovely, thank you. So Mark, looking at your growth proposals, there's a table set out with a list of items. There's no supplementary information actually explaining to us in more detail. But can you talk us through how you selected these growth proposals, and were there others that just didn't make the cut as you were developing this budget before us today?
I'm just trying to get to the table. Give me 1 second.
Page 30, I think it is, of your budget submission, if that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I just start on
yes,
start
of course,
on that?
Ian, of
so
course.
the way we you'll be aware, the way that we present this is that we have last year's growth, changes that have been made in year, then we get the revised position on last year's growth, plus we get new growth. A lot of these things have been built up sort of during the year, decisions made in the year that have an ongoing effect. So, for example, we made a decision early on to put additional money into vetting because we knew that obviously we knew we had additional recruitment and we need to speed that up. We had a number of relatively small investments that we agreed throughout the year. So additional investment in catering, some additional investment around building rooms, additional investment in our commercial capacity, and the full year effect of that then goes into this new growth table. So the process it's been an ongoing process as we go through the year as business cases internally arise. And then another good example, for example, was the mobile phones. So Sir Mark agreed on the rollout of mobile phones to everyone. So we built the costs of this year's costs into by using the underspend that was accruing this year, but then we've got the pressures going forward next year. So that goes into the growth table. So there's a whole sort of different process that we review as a board through the year and through IAM, the MOPAC's investment process as well.
Okay, Mark, you've come in new to this,
so these are the growth, sort of the consequence of growth during the year, as Ian says, which is part of that sort of nearly balanced budget. They're not the factors that I was talking about at the start in terms of what it will take in terms of reform to stabilise some of the challenges we're facing.
That's not in here.
That's not in here.
You said
as the paper says, we're finalising those costs, and that's sort of several tens of millions more, we think, and we'll have those figures in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah. So, but within what we've got here, vetting, it's not just the increase in officers. I mean, that was were criticised for your existing officers not being vetted and so on. So that I understand. Talk us through a bit more. Met operating model. What is that? Returner scheme. What is that?
Okay. The Met operating model was a piece.
Can you put your mic on? Sorry, and I know it's fiddly here.
Sorry. The Met operating model was a piece of work that we undertook with the previous management team at the end of the last financial year into this year to basically look at. Given the growth that had come into the organisation with additional officers, to look at whether it was in the right shape. So whether there were certain support areas that would need some additional investment, and we, through that piece of work, we made a number of small, relatively speaking, allocations to certain areas in the organisation. So I think we put some money into intelligence, we put some additional money into forensics, we put some money aside for trust and confidence, put some money aside for sort of data and digital. But that was a process that happened, that was reallocating some funding, but it happened after we'd closed the budget. So again, the way the tables work, the full year effect of that we have shown in here.
Okay, and what's stabilisation?
So those are some of the early costs that have come out of the work Sir Mark's asked for around reform and stabilisation. So we've put some money aside for additional staff into professional standards, for sort of rooting out corruption. We've put some money aside for a data warehouse. I'll have to check my crib sheet for
that's and then the returner scheme.
So the returner scheme is where we've got sort of pension abatement. So if somebody retires and comes back with the abatement rules, they can't earn more than the salary when they left the organisation. So we agreed that there a process that we'd cover we'd pay the extra cost, the pension costs, to encourage a set number of returners to come back to help with our recruitment.
And the 4 million pension admin presumably is to cover, is it the McLeod?
It's the administration around McLeod.
But in some ways this feels dated. You've got a new commissioner, new priorities, going to be looking for tens of millions for your reform costs. Will this be rejigged? When can we expect something that feels up to date with where you're going to prioritise?
As Mark said, absolutely. We at the moment we haven't got the full cost of reform because we are still working those up. So we're in the coming weeks. We hope to have a clear review, certainly before Christmas, of the estimated costs for the reform initiatives that have been outlined.
And then the mobile phone rollout is something, Sir Mark, you've talked about a lot. So am I right that not every police officer currently has a mobile phone? They have to rely on their own or something ridiculous?
So a lot of forces have issued mobile phones as standard. We, for whatever reason, haven't. And you end up with officers sort of making the job work with their own mobile phone, which from a practice and data perspective is not great in a whole range of different ways. We also be giving officers the equipment to do their job properly. So we've managed to... We're rolling out a couple of BCUs before Christmas. It's about 29,000 phones, which isn't a sort of overnight acquisition, but technology department are doing an amazing job, and we're pretty optimistic to get them all in place by the 1st of April. And that then goes with the different applications they have, so they can do more of their work on the move more easily. So it should sort of free up time, and goes back to the chair's point about efficiency earlier on.
Good. I think that's all my questions actually answered. Thank you.
Susan, Assembly Member Hall.
Thank you. What is the over £7 million per year for the Palester lease and catering? And what will that deliver for those costs?
So that 7 million is a collection of things that includes Palester. I think that was some work around some hearing rooms for DPS, but I would have to go back and check that. Catering was around our new catering contract that we've just introduced a couple of months ago, and we used and as you would expect in £4 billion, there's quite a lot of little things. So we just sort of put them all together in that area.
Okay, if you could send that to us, that would be helpful. Then if I go on to the officers, I really think this is such a good idea, bringing officers back out of retirement, especially given that we've got so many new ones at the other end. How many officers do we hope to get back in through that scheme?
I'd have to confirm the exact number. I think it's between 300 and 400, but I'll have to confirm the exact number if that's okay.
Okay, yeah, I'd be interested in that. And then if we're looking at the budget submission, also includes a 15 million per year saving of staff pay. Can you provide more details on what that involves?
We've looked at our staff pay. You will see that the staff pay budget has been increasing, but we have found some challenges with recruitment. You'll see in the Q2 position that we're underspending on staff pay this year, and whilst we are recruiting and we are increasing, it's taking longer than we have assumed in the budget. Therefore, our working assumption is that we will be able to take about 15 million out of the budget next year by just due to the length of time it's taking to recruit.
Good. That's good. Thank you very much. Just very, very quickly going back, bringing ex-officers back, are we looking at specifically the higher ranks or literally across the board?
It's not really the higher ranks. That's not the problem. It's more junior officers that we're looking to bring back in. I think we set a threshold of you've left in the last, I think it was 5 years, maybe 3 or 5 years. So obviously you want people's skills to be still fairly current. But I've spoken to a few of them. They're enjoying coming back and they're having a second leaf of life.
And obviously they're re-vetted before they come back.
Yes.
Yeah, and then given what sort of training, the basic training back again, or what?
I'm not sure the details of their refresher training, but there will be some refresher skills, clearly.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Okay, any more questions on this section? Okay, let's then move on to capital delivery, and I think we've got a bit of a double act going on. So it'll be Assembly Member Prince followed by Assembly Member Ramesh Desai.
Good morning, Sir Mark.
Morning.
How have you planned the new proposed capital programme to support operational performance?
So in terms of the existing capital programme, there are some there's some sort of day-to-day factors in there. As you can see, there's vehicle replacement, there's sort of building maintenance and those sorts of issues. The two big programmes that are in there that have been there for some time are our two big technology replacement systems, which should improve operational performance. There's the Connect system, which is our crime custody intelligence system, which has started rollout last week, and that's a two-phase rollout now and April. And the first phase has gone pretty well. The technology is stable. A couple of minor glitches to be sorted, but it's working out very well. So that's encouraging in terms of that programme and the benefits of that coming through, particularly when the second phase rolls out in April. The second is the command and control programme, which is still not completely stable as a programme. That's aimed for late next year or the year after, and we're still working through the suppliers to try and get that programme under control. So those are two big elements. There are other areas touched on in here which are part of the work that I've got going on in terms of our new strategy. So, for example, the estates programme, you'll be aware that we're reviewing it was getting close to a final strategy document, but I think the strategy we're now pushing towards, there are some refinements that need to take place. I had some reservations on the amount of blended working it was assuming. I also had some reservations on the neighbourhood footprint. It's if we're going to have the strongest neighbourhood policing ever, we need our officers to be within a reasonable striking distance of their wards, and I think there's some gaps in there that we might want to fill. So we're looking at some issues like that as part of tweaking the excellent work that's been done on the estate strategy. So there will be some refinements to come in with this along with the other investment proposals.
Thank you, that's helpful. Is the new proposed programme less ambitious than in previous years? And if so, will this address previous issues of over-optimism with regards to the ability of the MPS to deliver the programme?
I think I'd like us to be very ambitious, but also realistic. I think the two are hopefully the two are possible alongside each other. Certainly, you'll see that Claire Davies, Director of Resources and People, and Ian have done some great work kicking the tyres, and I think you and MOPAC have challenged us previously with unrealistic programming, and you'll see there's over 50 million been taken out here of some of that optimism bias, which is the recommended Cabinet Office approach to looking for optimism bias in programmes, and there may be more to come out in due course on that. But so trying to be ambitious because the public of London would expect it, but also being realistic at what is deliverable in sensible timescales, and we haven't always got that right, and that's been reflected, I think, in both our capital, frankly, and our reserves frame, and that's what we've been trying to get underneath.
What do you feel have been the operational impact of the consistent under-delivery of MOPAC and the Met's capital programme?
That's a really hard one to draw. I mean, some of the under-delivery is is the disappointing slipping of programs, which is unavoidable. So if you have a particular program benefits, then that program slips by 6 months, then that capital goes from one year to another, but also you obviously see you delay the benefits coming from that. Those are fairly straightforward. If we slip on improvements to vehicles and buildings, then obviously that has it's hard to measure the causality directly into operational effect, but these things add together, don't they, in terms of how well equipped and set up officers feel.
Yeah, I'm just thinking aloud about technology has always been a problem, hasn't it?
Yeah,
and
sort of
underinvestment in that.
I mean that's a slightly sort of different point, but sort of as I said at the start, the underinvestment in technology, particularly in terms of data, we're not as data-led as an organisation as we need to be. The best modern organisations use data and analytics to be as precise in their deployment as possible. Frankly, we were discussing 6,000 officers rather than 4,500 uplift. Even if I had a magic wand and lots of money and I could double our resources overnight, I would still have to make choices in terms of how they're deployed, because the crime and disorder demand will always be greater than we can meet. And the way you are successful in that context is you have the best data, so you can work out where you can have the best effect, whether that's the best effect in terms of how you deploy in a community to increase trust and confidence, or whether that's the best effect in dealing with the sort of the violent people across London who cause knife crime. It's the same point, and that's where I want us to invest more in that side, and that's part of the work we're doing on reform, as I was saying earlier.
Thank you, that's helpful. Good morning, Enver. This one's for you. The Q2 performance report suggests MOPAC and the MPS will once again be using the Q2 forecast as a revised budget for the rest of the year. To what extent is this a transparent way of reporting financial performance, and is this approach consistent with other parts of the GLA group?
Good morning, Assembly Member. I think I've expressed concerns in previous attendances at this committee about revised budget being used loosely across the group. But in this particular case, Lisa and I have worked quite closely on it, and in this case, the revised budget is actually a necessity because it does conform with accounting practice in that if there is additional external funding, and in this case there has been additional Home Office grant from what the original budget had set, you would end up in a situation where you'd end up having an expenditure budget and a income budget that would be out of sync through the rest of the year, and therefore having plenty of variances that just cancel each other out. Whereas here the permission to spend, the delegation, has been increased because of the additional external funding, and so consequently the budgets have been revised in theory on a one-off basis to reflect that additional external income. So it is consistent in this particular case.
That is consistent with the rest of the family, as we like to call it.
Well, we're trying to ensure that the rest of the family are changing budgets in that context, as MOPAC and the Met have done on this particular occasion, to reflect when there's actually an increased power to spend, an increased permission to spend because of additional funding, not because there's been some internal shifting of money within the organisation.
Thank you. Back to you, Sir Mark. While there are still significant delays and slippages across the Met's capital programme in the current year.
So there's some optimism in there, as we discussed earlier, and that's something we're working on to try and get much more assertive in our oversight of our budgets, and to say that accounts for the sort of 50 million we've already taken out, and that's some of that optimism bias. So that's partly about how realistic we are, and some of it has been, a lot of it, we've got two very big challenging programmes, and getting those to be stable is one of the things that we haven't done a good enough job at. If you look at the HMIC Engage process, one of the points in their, I think, 14-point letter in terms of putting us in Engage was to high-risk IT programmes, the two I mentioned earlier, Connect and Command and Control. So we're making progress. The first one of those is now delivering. The second one, we've still got some work to do. So I think stabilising those two big boulders in the programme will be a big part of getting that getting the numbers more consistent and more reliable.
do you think this slippage and or underspend will have an impact on next year's budget? I.e., obviously you'll be able to roll some over, but may the question come when you ask for more money, the question will be asked, well, you didn't spend what you had last year.
So I think there's a general point, isn't there, about financial reliability and sort of I want to run a financially reliable organisation that has a grip on its finances, is tight on its efficiencies, its sort of reserves are at a sensible level, its capital programme is gripped and as reliable as these things can be. And I think we've got a bit to go on that. I say Claire and Ian are working hard on that and already making very, very good progress. So I'm optimistic we will get tighter on it, but I do recognise there is something to do.
You referred earlier to the estates programme, which I think quite sensibly you are reviewing. I assume by that you may be suggesting that some of the properties that have been earmarked for disposal may now not be disposed to give you a bigger footprint. That will obviously have a knock-on effect to your capital receipts.
That is that must be possible, albeit I think we started this journey sort of 8-10 years ago with an estate that was largely designed in the sort of, I know, between about 1870 and 1970, frankly, for different policing context. So,
sorry, Sir Mark, can I leave it there because I just tripped into someone else's question, so I'd rather stop. But that's all right. Sorry, Umesh, okay. I do apologise. I was leaning on my papers and I didn't see the question.
I didn't realise it was so territorial. I'll stop there.
We are both in EA, but we do have our different. Sorry.
I think the concerns that we have about the estate management strategy transcends political boundaries. So, if we could start off with you, Sophie, and then come to you, Mark. Well, no, let me start with you, Sir Mark, carrying on from where Assemblymember Prince left off. So my question really was, how is the lack of estate strategy impacting on the Met's finances? You started answering it, but...
I don't think there's a lack of an estate strategy. There's a sort of we've been doing a massive amount of estates work over the last decade, which I visit many police buildings in the last 3 months, and so many of them have seen refurbishment and are much better for officers than they were a decade ago. So we've made an awful lot of progress, which I think is very positive. But you constantly have to keep looking forward on a subject like estates, particularly, don't you? Because it's a long-term piece of work. You can't make sudden changes. And the latest revision, I think there's been lots of good work in there, but there's a couple of issues that I mentioned earlier that are of concern to me that I don't think are quite aligned with the strategy we want to pursue, and we're making those revisions as we speak.
Okay, I think it's more the speed that we're concerned about. I mean, I know this exact time, and we're talking of sort of capital, the buildings and infrastructures, but it's more the pace of delivery. But if I can come to you, Ian, how is inflation expected to impact on costs related to delayed estates projects?
Sorry, can you just repeat?
How is inflation expected to impact on the costs related to the delayed estates projects?
So, we've certainly for the budget for next year, we've taken we've gone through all of our running costs to reassess inflation. Our previous plans, we've always put aside about £10 million a year for inflation, which has worked for our running costs. This year, we knew that was not to be the case, so we have reviewed the costs of utilities, we have reviewed the costs of our major contracts, and we've made some other assumptions for some of the non-contract expenditure like fuel, etc. And this budget includes about £40 million of additional costs to cover inflation for next year for revenue. And we reassess the capital programme through our capital scrutiny process. We reassess that and restate it each year, which is what you see in front of you here.
Okay, and just to finish off on this strategy, if I can ask your views, Sophie. So the MPS estate strategy has been described as, quote, the elephant in the room, unquote. The Met business plan for 2021 to 24 states that the development of a new strategy will be concluded in Q1. What's the latest position?
As Sir Mark said, he's rightly reviewing the estate strategy because, as an incoming new commissioner with different priorities, he is reviewing it in terms of the work, that balance around who can work at home and who can't, neighbourhood policing as well, but also making sure that it fits fits his vision for the Metropolitan Police. And I think that's absolutely right. It is delayed, and we all know it's delayed. I've possibly asked every police and crime committee, which is perfectly reasonable. Where is the estate strategy? It has been delayed for a couple of other very important reasons. One of which was the police uplift programme. We had to review the estate strategy to make sure that an estate strategy that was developed at times of reduction in police officers obviously has to be reviewed when we get to an increase in police officers. I would, however, just say that I think there is an absence of a final document of an estate strategy and some decisions to be made. But that, as Sir Mark says, that does not mean that there hasn't been significant works and significant movement and progress. I am signing off decisions around refurbishment, which have, and we have also opened a new police, refurbished police station as well. And also, we have also sold buildings in this financial year, and we have always taken the decision that what does the Metropolitan Police know for sure are in relation to the buildings they don't need, and therefore we can sell. That has always happened and has happened this year as well. So it's not that the lack of an estate strategy has meant there has been a pause and nothing has been happening. It just means that the forward-looking in sort of years 2, 3, 4 is still to be decided, but there are still decisions being taken and have been taken.
Thank you. If I can come back to you, Sir Mark. So I want to just ask you a question about capital delivery in the context of operational performance, because we can talk about underspans and borrowing and all that, but to the public out there, it's about the performance of your officers and how capital programs sort of impinge upon the performance. And very specifically, I want to ask you about your where you are with your digital forensic capacity, and particularly which crimes are most impacted by limited digital forensic capacity. There was underspent because of the delay in the business case for investment in digital forensics to the tune of £4.9 million. So what impact has this had on, or rather, which crimes are most impacted by your limited capacity in this field?
I don't know exactly what's behind that particular one, but just more generally, digital forensics is one of the hardest subjects to keep pace with. There is not one solution out there. There's so many aspects from getting into devices, examining the data, analysing the data, presenting it at court, dealing with damaged devices, dealing with encrypted data, seizing data off servers, everything from servers down to phones. And there are multiple suppliers out there. It's quite a dynamic technology market, and that's a hard one to work in. If you compare that to the established police market, so when we look at a command and control system, there are only sort of less than a handful of organisations running command and control systems of the scale that we would be comfortable and resilient enough and proven enough to deploy in the Met, and that big long procurement is what we're working on. Conversely, in this space, there are hundreds of small companies. Some of them are selling things that are fairly flaky. Some of them are selling amazing sort of tools that can accelerate our work, and trying to keep pace with that is very difficult. I think it's quite hard for our classic sort of governmental procurement system to move at the pace that these organisations do. And I've been talking with our head of commercial about how we get more agile and experimental in a controlled way to keep pace with the marketplace, but make sort of good use of public money at the same time. So I think there's some different approaches required in that environment, which reflects the market and the technology context, where you'd approach it differently to how you would replacing your command and control system.
And are you able to give us an idea of some sort of a timeline for increasing your capacity for digital forensics?
It's a permanent mission, frankly. So the sort of every time there's new updates on one of these and new devices, it presents new challenges for the digital forensics context. So there's not there's not an end destination. It's more a constant effort to keep pace with how criminals are operating. You saw the massive fraud operation, Operation Labyrinth, we ran the other day, and that covers the whole range of sort of covert, intrusive, digital capabilities, through to the post-arrest seizure of thousands of devices and the ability to triage and analyse those to build cases. It's a very, very complex operating environment.
And finally, something that I think you touched about earlier in your opening statement about rebuilding trust and confidence. So MOPAC has listed rooting out corruption and upholding robust ethics, conduct and standards, using new tools to increase understanding on what systems are being used and for what, as key priority from the KC Interim report. What will be the structure of this and how much will it cost?
We can write you on some of the numbers, but in terms of some of the operational details, so everything from improving our ability to see how people use our own systems, we have some capability we can improve it, looking at our ability to monitor our phones and improving that sort of thing, all the way through to something which I've been pushing since I've been here, and we've got some new capability to get better at data washing our personnel data, i.e. sort of officers and staff's names, etc., against various national databases to make sure that nobody has had a brush with the law whilst they've been employed by us and avoided telling us about it, because that would be a serious issue of concern. So taking something which is quite a hard thing to keep up with manually and being able to do it through data washing is one simple example of how technology can transform our ability to stay on top of vetting, which is one of those issues which you've seen being criticised nationally.
Thank you.
Okay, can I have Assembly Member Pidgeon followed by Assembly Member Hall?
A couple of things I wanted to pick up from the discussion. One, let's go back to the estate strategy, and obviously I always talk about Wimbledon Police Station, Teddington, all those, and Sophie and I have been writing about this between us for years. But actually there is an issue, and I'm wondering, Sir Mark, if you're considering this as part of your review, around response times. And obviously in answer, thank you for answering very promptly Mayor's questions, you know, it showed that in the last year, on average, 3 hours for the standard response rather than an hour across London. In some boroughs, Redbridge, for example, it was 10 hours in 1 month alone. That damages trust and confidence. Are you reviewing the response bases as well? Because maybe you have too few, particularly in some of these outer London boroughs, and that's causing an issue of getting police to where they need to be.
I've seen no evidence that the issues on response times are significantly driven by the sort of long-term change in estates we've done over the last decade, because frankly response officers are largely on patrol. It's not a fire service response where you need your police stations at certain locations because everyone's waiting for a call. They're out on patrol. So I don't see that as the biggest driver, and there are benefits to having officers together in terms of supervision, in terms of briefing. So that's not the key issue. There are other issues with response times which go to sort of our demand management, our deployment practices, the pressures we've got with other agencies' work, as I've mentioned several times before, the mental health and other issues. So there are many other factors that are driving that and having a far greater effect than the locations of the bases.
Locations. So that's not part of your review of the estate strategy?
No, I've seen no,
okay.
It's not.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Just wanted to clarify that. And then I'm always fascinated. You talk about data so much, and it's, you know, really interesting how you're pushing that. You want to be a data-led organisation. If there are plans for new computerised systems, technology that need to be rolled out really quickly, all we hear year on year is how your programme slips, nothing gets delivered, public sector and anything to do with IT, you know, just add several years and several zeros to the end, it seems to me. So what are you doing? Are you getting some specialist staff in? Are you looking to have someone driving this so you can get it procured really quickly, and the flexibility in the procurement, as you say, to make sure stuff is up to date?
Exactly, and the sort of at the centre of this to becoming data-led is having a data. The sort of the people who understand this world talk about data warehouses, data lakes, all these different solutions. But basically, to use my own language, having a bucket with all your data in that is a sort of reliable, stable bucket of data that you can apply clever tools to give you insight. And just to give you one really practical example, I want us to be able to deal with predatory male offenders with the same rigour that we deal with terrorists. So between the police and security services, we have basically all the sort of extremists and terrorists we're worried about stacked in an order of priority from the most dangerous to the least dangerous, and there's constant work going on that, which is partly led by data and partly led by human intervention. We're nowhere near that in terms of protecting women and children from predatory men. If you look at recent convictions of over the last few years for rape and domestic abuse and harassment and stalking and paedophilia online, you rapidly get into many tens of thousands of offenders. You are not going to prioritise those through people sitting at computers working out what order to put them in. You're only going to be able to do that if you have the right data and the right tools to semi-automate it. You need human judgments as well. You can't do it all from computer, but you're going to do that. But if we're going to do a better job protecting women and children, I want to be able to say, well, here are the most dangerous 100 people, here are the next 1,000, here are the next 5,000 that perhaps partners can help with in terms of diversion of the work. Bringing that science to it requires a data-led approach. So this is not sort of theoretical geekery. This goes to our ability to protect people in London, and women and children is one example of that.
No, that's really, it's a science. I like that. I think that's really, really interesting. Thank you for that. Just, obviously it might be your deputy or someone who comes to this committee in a year's time. What should we expect in terms of spend on the capital programme? What concrete things will the Met have that doesn't currently have or will have changed?
So certainly you will have seen this programme of work on sort of data warehouse and analytics. That will be a key part of it. They'll be driving our business. That's the most important component. I think there will be something around the estate strategy and neighbourhood policing where we are, hopefully we've made some progress in terms of, well, they've had a strategy and trying to implement it in terms of getting our neighbourhood officers approximate enough to their beats to be able to make the difference we would expect to make. So there'll be many smaller issues, but those are the two big ones that leap to mind straight away.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Just before I take Assembly Member Hall, I would like just take this opportunity really. So, just following up on the data issue, does that mean that you take a different position than the previous commissioner about the domestic register of abuse, which is data based and driven of the most prolific domestic violence issues under your MPS issue? Do you take a view that you would take that's the way forward and where you need to go? I'm not saying you have to commit yourself here and now, but what is your view of using that data in terms of monitoring the most dangerous in our society?
So certainly us and partners having that data and being very focused is critical. Some of the public debate about do you have publicly available registers and how far do you go in that is
publicly available.
That's
for you to use to target your work.
But for us to use, I mean, if we've got many, from the data I've seen so far as we work up this, we've got many tens of thousands of men who you would say there's a reason to worry that he's a predator in London. If you look at registered sex offenders, rapists, domestic abusers, harassers, etc., from recent convictions, we are never going to wrap our arms around controlling all of that. And frankly, some of them are very dangerous, some of them actually are very unlikely to reoffend. So why wouldn't we have... It's not so much about... the register is the starting, but the list is not the point. The point is being able to prioritise on the list so you can have best effect with your resources to protect people.
You've already got a target list of 500 within the MPS of the most serious, prolific abusers that could be adapted and used, a bit like the sexual offenders list for monitoring and inter-partnership agencies. It's a question of using that. But more importantly is, will you come behind and support, actually the Assembly does, and I think the Mayor's got a position, of supporting the police to get, because it takes national legislation to do that, and it will make a real difference to potential victims and protect people in our community, because it's prioritising and managing and, you know, being more intrusive on the most prolific.
I think we could. So we have some lists in individual subjects like domestic abuse. We've identified top few and harassment. We haven't brought it all together in a systematic way. That's the point I'm making. We can do all this without legislation ourselves. I think when it comes to sharing data with partners and creating a more joined-up approach, then that may require some legislation. I think most of the legislation debate, unless I've missed the point, is generally about publicly sharing it, which is a different point.
Basically, we're going to nudge you a bit more because having the MPS on board and the Commissioner on board would be very useful in terms of a national lobby. But we'll come back to you on that. I was being cheeky and just following up that question. Assembly Member Hall.
Thank you. One of my questions has been answered, but the one question which actually hasn't. So the estate strategy, which we keep coming back to, is now having to wait because you're new in post. I completely understand that. So how many officers are you assuming you're going to have as you're now dealing with the estates? Because we must narrow this down. Are you looking at thinking, right, I'll have an extra 6,000 officers as from where we were back in 2019. The uplift was announced in 2019, so I'm not quite sure why it's changed because of the uplift, because we knew that was coming anyway. But how many officers are you going to assume that you will have when you tell us this is my estate strategy?
So there's like any plan, well, I think we need to have a strategy that is based on what we know we'll have, but then has some agility in it. Because if you create a strategy which gives you zero manoeuvrability, and if there's any change, so we've got mayoral and national elections in 2024, that may generate some big discussions about public policy on policing, that may generate some big workforce numbers. Coming up with a state strategy which gives us zero manoeuvrability would be foolish. So it is important to me that we do have some flexibility in it. Whether we will make an exact assumption of numbers in it, I'm not sure, frankly. But I will want to make sure we've got some flexibility. So if we get extra funding opportunities and the resources change as a result of some of that political debate, for example, then we've got the ability to move quickly.
Okay, so roughly how many I accept you need flexibility, but very roughly what are you aiming for?
So you want me to pull a number out the air, I'm not going to, but I would want a strategy which said, well, we've got enough flexibility in this strategy. If we had X thousand more people in the organisation, we could think we could accommodate it, but if it was Y thousand, we would struggle. I'd want to have that sort of conversation rather than pinning my colours to a particular exact number, which is slightly mythical out with of that sort of funding context.
Okay, but this committee and indeed the police committee have been asking for this police strategy, estate strategy, for so long, and we keep getting different reasons as to why we're not getting it.
It's my fault this time.
No, and that's been about the only decent excuse we've had, quite frankly. But that will only last so long, Savant. So be warned, until we get that strategy, we will be asking questions. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, let's move on to the next section. Assembly Member Clark.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. Speaking of waiting for numbers, Sophie, to you, since 2017-2018, this committee has seen the last 6 budget submission plans to reduce MOPAC's reserves, and instead they've actually increased. So they've gone from 200 million in 2018 to 569 million this year. What makes this year's plans different?
So those figures do include, that's not just, that's the overarching MOPAC budget, which includes the Metropolitan Police budget, which does explain why the figures are so large. What makes it different this year is, as Sir Mark has already talked about, the increase of grip on the budget and increase of grip on the reserves. You'll have seen, I hope you see within the budget papers already, that you can see there has been a very, very forensic look at the 2 sort of pots of reserves, as I think about it, the earmark reserves, and then there's the general reserve, which is one fund for, for emergencies, really. £54 million has already been taken out of the earmarked reserves because of that forensic look as to what really has been earmarked and whether there really are plans to spend it. So there, I think that should give you as a committee confidence that there is that grip. It certainly gives me confidence that there is that grip, and that will continue, and we are still looking at the reserves, and that type of grip will continue going forwards.
Okay, and so on the 3rd of August, this committee requested a full breakdown of the earmark reserves. Will we get that at some point?
There is a table in the budget proposal of a breakdown of the reserves and what the earmarked reserves and what they're spent on. In terms of more detail, I'm really happy. I don't know if Lisa, we can write to you about that, but I think there's more detail that's needed.
Okay, because it seems that this committee's been waiting sort of for long. So more detail would be good if we could have that in writing would be fine. And Ian, are you exploring options in terms of the budget gap identified in the budget submission to reduce the level of borrowing for the capital programme?
Well, we're always looking at options, but there is a reality on the capital programme. We've got there are limited ways that we can fund it. We've got capital receipts, but for obvious reasons, those come in as one-off. We can only sell buildings once, and then we don't get a capital grant. So we don't. So therefore, our only other option is revenue contributions, which we try and make where we can, or borrowing. So we keep it constantly under review. Of course we do, but there is there is a reality that to fund a capital programme for an organisation of our size without any additional support, then we will need to borrow.
Thank you, Ian. And the reserve for the additional 1,300 officers that have been funded by the Mayor will be fully used up by 24-25. How will this budgetary pressure be addressed?
So yes, the reserve that we got set aside, the 118 million, we're drawing down over 4 years, and at the moment, it feeds into our gap in the following year. So we will have choices to make when we've got a gap, as we talked about before. We've got an efficiency programme that will address some of it, probably not all. We're going to have choices to make in the coming years about how we address the balance of that gap.
Did you want to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. It's not the reserve for 1,000. It's not reserved for 1,300 officers. It's 1,000 officers that are funded from that. There's 300 already in the base, which will always be there going forward. So there is a pressure when that reserve does run out for 1,000.
Sorry, so the pressure is on the 1,000. Is what you're saying? On the 300. Okay.
Sorry, but you've missed a couple out on the other page. Did you ask about the earmarked one and the committee requested the info? I beg your pardon, I don't know where.
Okay, we're now moving on to the next section on value for money, and it's the violence reduction unit. And this will be asked by Assembly Member Rogers.
Thank you, Chair. I'll put my first question to Lisa, I think. Excuse me. How have you reached the assumption that the VRU will receive 9.4 million in funding from the Home Office in 25-26?
So the Home Office has confirmed that we've got 9.4 million of funding up until the 2024-25 financial year. So that's actually there in writing and confirmed. Beyond that, for 25-26, as we've said in the papers, we've made the assumption that that funding will continue, but we await confirmation of that in future years. Okay,
and is that assumption based on discussions? On what basis is that assumption made? Just because of what's happened in the past?
It's just something about being prudent as well around funding. Until we're told that it's not there, we've assumed that it will continue. There's no indication at the minute that it won't, but obviously we update our medium-term financial plan on an annual basis. So as and when more information comes out, then we will reflect and update the financial planning assumption at that point.
And when do you expect that further information?
So it's just really through the annual settlements that we get, and we tend to start to get information informally in advance of the final settlements. So as soon as we start to have those discussions with the Home Office in terms of what funding might look like, then we can adjust the assumptions going forward. But I think for now the important thing is that we've got a 3-year financial settlement, which is good news for us, and that really helps with our financial planning up until 24-25.
Of course, and that helps you plan for the longer term, doesn't it? So, I mean, do you have any contingency in place in case this funding you hope for doesn't materialise?
So we use, so you'll see from the papers, again, in terms of the strategy and the approach around reserves, that we're using reserves to mitigate reductions in funding. So you'll see that the Home Office funding for the VRU is reduced from 12.7 million by 3.3 million in the next financial year. And we're using our reserves to help mitigate and manage the impact of that. What we've also been able to do is work with the VRU to develop a 3-year financial strategy so that we're able to give that certainty as well. Where we're commissioning services, we can give that certainty to our providers.
Okay. Thank you very much. Next question is for Sophie. The budget submission states the VRU has developed an outcomes framework and consulted on it. The Assembly has called for a performance framework for several years and we haven't seen a copy. When will you be sharing a copy with the Assembly?
So there is a draft outcomes framework. I've been briefed on it and we've gone through that with the Violence Reduction Unit, and it will be published soon. It has been consulted on. It was actually, there was a presentation of it to the Partnership Reference Group probably 2 meetings ago, in terms so that we could get stakeholders as well as the individual meetings going, meetings around consultation. It will be published soon around that outcomes framework.
So this is obviously something that has been of significant interest to the Assembly, so appreciate it's being published soon, but can you give us a flavour of the kinds of KPIs or monitoring methodology that's going to be in there?
Yes, I mean, in terms of the outcome framework, I mean, this is not finalised or, absolutely finalised, so don't quote me on the exact heading. So there's the priority areas of the Violence Reduction Unit, which are clearly, around children and young people, families, educational settings, communities in place, and each one will look at what is the actual impact on that for, as you would expect, reduced violence offending, improved well-being, improved family relationships, and improved well-being at school, and then underneath that there's I think this is really important in terms of the work of the Violence Reduction Unit, also looking at what the organisational impact is. Obviously underneath those headlines there's a hell of a lot of detail around what the indicators are, and that has been absolutely finalised at the moment. But this performance outcome framework, when it's published, I think will give a very good narrative around the work of the Violence Reduction Unit, and the ability, quite rightly, for that accountability to be there. And you can see, you can see what inputs are going in. The Violence Reduction Unit has been very successful in getting additional grants in, and this outcome framework will give you the performance and the impact. I would say, obviously, and this isn't as a trying to sort of dodge the question. The Violence Reduction Unit has been set up as a long-term venture. Some of the outcomes will take time to come through, and I think we always need to be clear about that. I think the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit's evaluation was about 16 years after it was first set up, and the Violence Reduction Unit has been actually up and running for 3 years now.
Okay. I guess on that point then, would the performance reporting timeline be an annual report, or what's your thinking around that?
I think this will be, I'm pretty sure this will be a quarterly report, but I'd have to double check on that. And obviously we as MOPAC publish a quarterly performance report as well. So we would expect some of the outcomes from this framework to be put into quarterly performance reporting.
Thank you. Back to Lisa for my next question. How can you reassure the committee that MOPAC will not continue to reprofile commissioned activity to future financial years, as has been the case for the last few years?
So if we just go back to the earlier example where we talked about the Home Office funding and the fact that we've got a 3-year funding settlement, that does enable us to have more certainty around our financial planning, and that will certainly help in terms of that reprofiling, and we should see less of that going forward. However, I think when you look at, and going back to Enver's point about revised budgets, MOPAC already in the current financial year has received another 25 million in grant funding that has come through during the year. So that grant funding tends to come through to support particular projects or particular outcomes, and it doesn't always have to be spent in the financial year that it's given. So I think if we're seeing a continuation of grants coming in partway through the year, just by the sheer fact that we need to plan on what that money is going to be spent on and commission those services, I think it's inevitable that we will still see some reprofiling going forward. And I think it's just about being realistic. But wherever we can, particularly with the 3-year funding settlements, we will start to reduce and have that greater certainty.
Okay. And looking through the papers, there's a suggestion that some of the reprofiling is driven by a desire, almost as you just said, to provide longer-term interventions. But also there seem to be operational issues as well, such as the vacancy rate. Does that have do operational issues have an impact, have a bearing on reprofiling?
Absolutely. So we're seeing already in this financial year that we've got underspends within MOPAC's own budgets, particularly around staffing, and that is as a result of vacancies and the fact that it does take us a while sometimes to recruit and go through the vetting process. So as part of our budget planning for the next financial year, we've taken a look at where we've got those recurring underspends. And we've done 2 things. So the first thing is, particularly on the supplies and services and the corporate type budgets, if we have a budget that doesn't normally spend up to the level that it's provided for, we have done a zero-based budgeting approach, and we've taken that out and we've reduced it to what we think is a realistic level. And we've also brought in a vacancy factor as well for some of our services, recognising the fact that we do have underspends on staffing routinely. And I think both of those actions should reduce underspends going forward. And it also makes sure that we're using the money in year as effectively as possible.
Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Just before I bring Assembly Member Desai in, I understand the partnership arrangements, but in terms of performance and outcomes, who's holding the ring? Is it the partners holding the ring? Is it MOPAC holding the ring? Or GLA holding the ring? Where does this all fit? It's sort of just in terms of... It was just going back, because I just wanted to ask the question, in terms of the way that the Deputy Mayor answered the question, I just want some clarity about who's holding who to account.
Sorry, are you talking about the violence reduction unit in particular? Sorry, of course, of course. So there is the part. You're right. It is a little bit of a complicated governance on here. However, the VRU does sit within MOPAC. So in terms of value for money, financial management, absolutely, you would expect any decisions being signed have been absolutely cleared and signed off, accountable to me. But clearly, the work of the violence reduction unit does cross City Hall. It also crosses a lot of large amount of, as with MOPAC work as well, actually, a large amount of funding comes from the Home Office, so there is accountability to the Home Office for performance. So the accountability is MOPAC overall, but there are other accountabilities as well, because of, as with victims commissioning, we are accountable to them, Ministry of Justice as well, as the VRU is accountable to the Home Office in terms of some of the money that flows into the violence reduction unit.
Just to pick off the issue of, when is it a proper time to do an assessment? Okay, you're 3 years in. We've talked about the Scottish experience being 16 years, which is quite reasonable, but there's obviously stuff that's short term. There's obviously that can give outcomes and not. So in terms of the document that's being produced at the moment, will that have issues around saying this is where we've this is been the outcome and this is being assessed by us, or independently assessed that actually this is the way forward and is working?
So the performance outcome framework that I described is the strategic high-level framework. With, and obviously underneath that you have all the programmes and projects of the violence reduction unit. Each one of those has evaluation within it. So that will add up to the strategic headlines. That is always being evaluated and continually evaluated, whether that be by the Violence Reduction Unit itself, because it's pure Violence Reduction Unit money, or, for example, through the Youth Endowment Fund. You know, a large amount of money comes through that. There is evaluation of that on a regular basis, as we also do for our MOPAC programmes. It is an ongoing process that then feeds into the headline strategic performance outcomes.
Thank you. Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. Some of my questions have already been answered, Chair. But Sophie, if I can start off with you. Now, I know that this performance framework report is soon going to be published, and in response to the question from the Chair, you've given us an idea of the structure of the report. And I don't want to put you on the spot, but are you able to give us a flavour of the actual details of the report in terms of outcomes, specific projects? I mean, surely you must have some idea.
No, I can't give you in terms of the... I'm smiling because when I first saw it, there were some figures in it, but there was a very small footnote going, these are sort of, made-up figures, because I was like... so I misunderstood what I was reading. I can't give you the figures for the strategic performance outcome framework. However, we do know, in terms of the I can ask, and I know you've asked Lib to come, and you'll be writing to the Director of the Violence Reduction Unit. She's very happy to go through the detail in terms of some of the evaluations and what that is already showing. And there are some of the programmes that you can already see it. But also, I would also point back that whilst, the Violence Reduction Unit has done some really innovative work, like the My Ends programme, which is already showing impact in the communities, and Lib can give you more detail about that. Some of the programmes are funding and continuation of funding for projects that are very well evaluated and we know work. For example, the youth workers in accident and emergency units. There is, detailed evidence over the years as to the impact that they have. So you can see that as well.
Oh, thank you. I mean, when is the report going to be published? You said soon. Any idea? I'm going to
have to give you
it's
soon, I don't have a date.
Okay, fine. But, I mean, that's the sort of thing I'm looking for. So just to give you an example, I attended a My Ends commissioned activity run by the Osmani Project in Tower Hamlets, and they were able to give us some indication of the people they've helped. The figure was over 80, which might not seem that big a number, but rather that, they helped 80 concrete young people. So the presumably report will have examples of...
So apologies. I mean, yes, of course, I can. There's been 4,000 families, 4,000 young people will get mentoring because of the work that the Violence Reduction Unit. We know that 80,000 young people have had diversionary activities because of the funding from the Violence Reduction Unit. That's not. You will underneath an outcome framework. You can have some of the inputs and the money that's been spent and the numbers of young people that have been worked with, but the outcome framework will have the impact, and that's really significant because I think you can always talk about the numbers that you've reached, but you want to know that you've reached them and it's made a difference.
Thank you. What is Operation Soteria, and what are its targets, and have they been achieved?
Operation Soteria is the development of a programme of work which was developed within MOPAC following on the rape review, which was published in 2019. We worked with the London's Victims Commissioner and nationally around what would transformation of rape investigation look like. That was called Operation Bluestone. It developed into Operation Soteria because the CPS were included in that work, and quite rightly included, because the investigation of rape is clearly a really important matter for the Metropolitan Police, but in terms of prosecutions, the CPS has a very, very important role to play. That operation, we put money into the investment of that, and it's been rolled out nationally. First of all, in Avon and Somerset, the Met have had its deep dive. It's a significant piece of work where academics go and look through and review the case files of rape cases, and it is now a Home Office piece of work, and they will be publishing soon, I think, the results of the deep dives that have happened in a number of forces. In terms of targets, the main target the main outcome that's going to happen is that there will be a national, what's it called? It's not an operating model, is it? It's a national police. it's an operating model for the way in which rape should be investigated will be the biggest outcome of that. And I think we're expecting that sometime next year. It's been worked on in terms of what the evidence is from the forces and how do you turn that into an operating model. That might not be quite the right phrase, so apologies if it's not.
And finally, Chair, Sophie said that the Violence Reduction Unit, quite rightly and understandably, is a long-term venture. There are no short-term gains. But in terms of funding, the Mayor has said that budget uncertainty has made it difficult to set long-term plans, and external funding for the unit reduces after 2023/24. Can we commit more money to the Violence Reduction Unit or the Mayor in future years in order to safeguard their programs and the support they offer?
I mean, the Mayor's been absolutely consistent in, one, setting up the Violence Reduction Unit and also in terms of its core funding and actually increasing core funding over the years. That core funding will continue. It's in the base and it will continue. The question of what happens with the Home Office funding at the end of 3 years for 25, 26 that there's uncertainty, we will have to face that pressure when it comes. Clearly, and it will always be, the long-term investment in the Violence Reduction Unit is not one that we would draw back from.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. You'll be pleased to hear we're on the last section, the last leg of this meeting. Let's then move to Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you very much. And my questions are for Sir Mark. And this is on the climate budgeting element of your submission. So you describe the climate budget as being a learning process, and that there will be more to come in future years. But could you just outline the kind of top challenges that you see for the Met in delivering on the Mayor's climate ambitions for 2030?
Yes, of course. So I'd broadly put this in two buckets. Go back to buckets again. Put in two buckets. There's using everything we possibly can do from within our existing spending to do where there's any choice we can exercise to be as green as we possibly can do. So I think in terms of building solutions, in terms of lighting, solar, electric cars, all of that, sort of wherever we can sensibly use money and maintain operational effect, but do it with a green hue, we will do that. And so that's a lot of our work, and Ian can give some of the detail on that. The second piece is what it would take in total to get to the Mayor's 2030 commitment, as you ask. And as you'll see in the papers, that identifies that's probably a further 400 million. Now, clearly, it's not my intention that operational policing in London should be undermined by money being diverted towards that 400 million. And likewise, the Mayor's been very clear with me that's not his expectation either. But it's about being very clear. What's the gap between what we can do by bending existing budgets to be as green as possible, between that and the full mayoral 2030 commitment, and that's that sort of roughly 400 million figure. And I think the Mayor will look at sort of alternate ways to generate sort of funding and ways to try and achieve that. But he's not suggesting that we bend our operational policing out of shape to get there.
So I suppose what I'm really wanting to dig into is the risks for the police in not decarbonising on the kind of 2030 trajectory. So, and I appreciate that's, there's a £400 million gap, and, we could talk for ages about where that 400 million might come from, whether it comes from government or whatever. But I'm just wondering whether you've done any thinking about the risks of not decarbonising on that timetable.
I'm not sure what they would. What sort of things you're hinting at there? I do apologise.
Let me explain a bit more. The TfL business plan says that since the government introduced the Energy Prices Act, the Mayor has paused the proposed relaunch of the first phase of the power purchase agreements. Now, it looks as if MOPAC is relying on the power purchase agreements as part of the figures for the forecast carbon emissions for the reductions for reductions in carbon. Now, should you, in that case, be sort of hedging against that by making sure that you are providing your own energy as far as possible, which would give you resilience against escalating gas prices? We don't know what's going to happen in the new year with gas prices. And you could, for instance, be kind of investing in solar. You could also be thinking about ground source, air source, heat pumps, and you're talking about a lot of new data center type activity. Heat can be recovered from data centres. We were hearing about it yesterday with Old Oak Common. It's new technology, but should you be kind of learning from what these other parts of the GLA are doing on heat recovery to see whether there aren't ways that you can avoid being reliant on either the power purchase agreements, which are currently on hold, or kind of the problems faced by escalating costs due to rising gas prices?
I think you're going to be going quite a bit beyond my specialist knowledge and possibly Ian's in some of those questions. But just in general terms, we're open to new ideas the whole time, and our sort of experts are looking at all these different possibilities. I would imagine they've looked at that one, though I can't say for certain. But clearly we're keen. Anything we can do without bending us operationally out of shape to get greener, we will absolutely do. I can give you my assurance on that. In terms of the particular thing on that TfL risk, I'm not cited on that, but I think Sophie might be.
So actually what I was going to say is that this is really early days. What you've got here is the beginning of the programme and the beginning of the journey, basically, and it's based on good practice from elsewhere in these sort of the C40 cities to publish a climate budget which is really clear about what the steps that need to be taken are, and actually the huge challenge in terms of affordability. It is a big challenge. So it is really early days. So the type of questions you're asking, we don't have the answer to at the moment. But basically, we're looking at those things. But I think one of the key things you really are asking is, how are we as the GLA family learning from each other? This is absolutely a cross-City Hall piece of work. The Metropolitan Police, there is a regular meeting around this, and the Metropolitan Police are very much plugged in. So if there is learning from TfL, it will come to the Met, and if there's learning from the Met, it will go to TfL as well. So there is it's very coordinated, this piece of work, because it is complicated. You don't want each of the different family members, having to work everything out for themselves.
Absolutely, and this climate budgeting is an incredibly powerful tool, and it just going through the process of scrutinising that yesterday, we discovered sort of huge risk related to escalating gas costs for heat networks in the Olympic Park. So I'm just going to give you a slightly more practical example of how the climate budgeting, how you could be being a bit more ambitious with your climate budgeting even at the moment. So yesterday in the Environment Committee, Catherine Barber, who's AD for Environment and Energy in the GLA, said something that I've seen with the change in target from 2050 being brought forward to 2030 for net zero, which is commensurate with the climate crisis. It's required a shift in mentality with people making investments. We see it with the group GLA itself when it comes to conversations with vehicle replacement or heating replacement. Now, if previously there was, she went on to say, if previously there was a belief we could have one more round with fossil fuel-based infrastructure, now our colleagues are wrestling with the fact that the next time they invest in what might have been a gas boiler, next time it would be a heat pump. Now, in your estates piece on the climate budget, it says the MPS budget assumes 97 million is spent on forward works and like-for-like replacement of end-of-life equipment such as gas boilers. Now, I would hope that you can take away the thinking of whether some of those gas boilers could actually be replaced with heat pumps or air source heat pumps, either ground source or air source heat pumps. But the heat pump technology would protect you from future gas price rises and would mean that you're not even if you're introducing more efficient gas boilers, they are still gas boilers. They're still based on fossil fuels, and it is possible to be replacing things like gas boilers with air source heat pumps.
Completely agree. The principle of looking for those alternatives, not least given the price of energy, whether case by case, the practicalities of them, as I understand, air source heat pumps aren't. You need a modern building that's highly insulated before it's effective. So there's all sorts of issues like that as well, but where possible, we ought to be doing it.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, Assembly Member Hall.
Thank you. Where possible, I think, is essential on that. The budget submission cites as a key risk affordability of funding set against the operational cost of delivering police and crime plan priorities. In other words, it may be a choice between fighting crime against delivering the Mayor's climate expectations.
I've been really clear that I've been really clear that there's no pressure on me to undermine fighting crime for this agenda.
Absolutely, and I'm coming on to say I'm glad there's no pressure. There should be no pressure. I'm going to say this because I was alarmed when I read that. Fighting crime is the most important thing. If you were given another 400 million, I'm sure you could find other ways of spending it other than on the climate in order to keep Londoners safe, and that is what Londoners want. And we must remember that it is the Mayor's target of 2030. If he wants to find separate funding for that, he should do that. Bleating that the government should be putting in money, it is the Mayor's target. So if that's what he wants, then he should fund that. Your money needs to be going on fighting crime, and I absolutely support what you've said, and I am very happy to hear that the Mayor would also rather we fought crime than dealt with this in this way.
Chair, can I just reiterate what Sir Mark has said? There's categorically no way that funding will be diverted from operational policing and fighting crime.
And I'm applauding that.
And on top of that, in addition to that, the Mayor is actually leading the development of different financing activities and initiatives in order to be able to look at how this funding, how this can be funded. So the Mayor is proactively developing financing initiatives which will enable this to happen. This is, and then clearly there are some things that government do need also to step up to the plate on in terms of the challenges of climate change. The one thing that we haven't also talked about in this is that with the changes and the if there is investment in climate change activities, and there will be, we are putting in place some for next year as well. There will also be cost savings. There'll be cost savings on the revenue budget in the medium to long term, and there'll be costs through energy use. So there is a balance here, but categorically there will be no diversion of money into frontline policing.
Well, I'm pleased that
away from frontline policing.
Good, yes, and I did say I approved of that to Mark Rowley about 5 minutes ago. But he has also been the one that's been proactively putting in these targets, which could give real issues to some of our services. I'll leave it at there. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Russell.
Just briefly, I wanted to add to what the Deputy Mayor said on about cost savings. Taking the climate budget seriously will also protect the Met and the rest of the GLA from the risks that are associated with escalating gas costs and other climate risks.
Okay, thank you for that. Are there any more questions from members of the committee? Look, can I thank you for the way that you've answered the questions. We're going to follow up with some further written questions. And we're obviously going to go back over some of the answers you gave us and maybe request some further information. We're very grateful for your attendance today. We're going to adjourn for a few moments to allow our next guest to come. But once again, thank you. Very quickly, what time is it? Are you okay? Yep. We're all right. Hi, can I welcome us back to the second part of this morning's proceedings? And with that, can we welcome our guests? So can I begin by Baroness Fiona Twycross, Deputy Mayor for Fire and Resilience. And can I say, on behalf of everybody around this table, we're very pleased that you received this award. Absolutely. It's a great honour to you, but it's also an honour to us because you were one of us. So we'd just like to say that. And that's echoed across this table. Welcome to Andy Rowe, Commissioner of the LFB. Welcome to Mostaque Ahmed, Director of Corporate Services, LFB, and as ever, Enver, Assistant Director of Group Finance and Performance of the GLA. Would you like to make a very quick opening statement, both of you? Short statement if you wish, or would you prefer? So, yep. Yeah, please do. Yep.
So I think really that the headline I'd give the committee is that we weren't in the right place. I don't think the last time we sat in front of this committee that would be the first acknowledgement. I think we've worked really hard to take on board kind of the feedback from that committee, knowing ourselves as part of the change process that we need to get our structures and systems in place where we didn't rely too much on reserves, where actually we presented a balanced budget and we took forward a genuine programme of kind of forensic analysis, professional scepticism, as my colleague calls it, to deliver proper budget efficiencies. I think we've done that if we look at the headline figures. So if we're looking at a budget gap after pressures of 27.5 million in 23-24, we've identified sensible budget reductions that maintain the sanctity of the operational front line of 23.4 million. We've only kind of resorted to use of reserves of around 4 million to proportionally offset immediate inflationary pressures, and we can clearly demonstrate that. In 24-25, obviously, there was a budget gap after pressures of about 19.6 million. Again, we've identified reductions of 18.9 million to meet that gap without touching the operational front line, and a small residual gap of 0.7 million to still be identified. Moving into 25-26, again, we see there's a budget gap after pressures of 17.3 million, but we've actually identified budget reductions of around 22.3 to give us a surplus of 5. So I think the figures speak for themselves in terms of a kind of change of approach, which was much needed, was part of the general change that is needed in the brigade and is, of course, ongoing. And I think that's probably all I would say at this moment and enable the committee to ask the questions it needs to.
Well, thank you for the way that you've approached that introduction, because that's quite helpful to the committee. Thank you. Okay, let's begin. So the implications of the budget, and one of the challenges that you face, is about the LFC's 5% pay award offer for 2023. And in the circumstances that have been rejected, so what's the next steps to resolve these pay negotiations? And it's not completely in your hands, but just give us an outline.
So I think, again, starting at the national level, I think one of my concerns is that there doesn't appear to be an exit strategy on either side of the negotiating table. That does bother me. Obviously, I have some influence. I employ nearly a quarter of the whole-time workforce in the UK, and I will be using that influence to seek a negotiated settlement, because not only is a fire strike the last thing Londoners need, it's also the last thing firefighters need. We have a good relationship with the London Regional FBU. We've got open channels of communication there. Where do I see it ending? I'm not sure, because obviously it sits within the context of many industrial disputes ongoing across nearly all of the public sector. I think the only assurance I can present this committee is that we will seek to proportionally resolve this through negotiation using our influence into those national mechanisms, and that we're all nothing out, whether national or local, in terms of trying to resolve it.
And of course, once that's resolved, there are further conversations that need to be had with government. And are those lines of communication open with government about issues of the affordability, who's paying for what's their contribution, hopefully a full contribution to any final settlement?
there's open communication with government. So I met the Minister recently to talk about exactly this. And Mark Harding and myself, so Mark obviously chairs NFCC, are both clear that employers, of which I'm one, have worked very, very hard this year to find the 5% offered within their existing budgets. I mean, they speak to the budget reductions, actually, that I've just given as a headline. Beyond this financial year, it is extremely difficult, because I think you can reasonably anticipate that what is currently proposed in the budget, in the context of a continued high inflation, the pressures through dispute may well have to be larger. To the Home Office's kind of credit, and to be frank, the ministers, the meetings we've had do show a practical understanding that we have not reached a point of resolution. Those pressures are real, and there is ongoing discussion about kind of local government settlement to recognise that. But it will all be in the delivery, won't it? We'll have to see what happens in that settlement as to whether or not we really meet the challenge ahead.
Just to start by saying thank you for your kind words at the beginning of the meeting, Chair. That's much appreciated. And I hope to do the Assembly proud as a former Assembly member in the House of Lords. On the impact of the potential strike and where we are with the industrial action, I think Andy didn't give himself full credit for the work he has personally put in at a national level to trying to resolve this, and with the National Fire Chiefs Council. I think that one of the issues, and there's a number of people in the room who were on the Fire Authority last time there was a strike. Actually, it might actually just be myself and Assemblymember Hall. And I think in the context of the discussion we had last week on the Culture Review, just to stress that actually the cost of a strike goes way beyond the financial impact, and we're also concerned about the ability of the Brigade to push forward on some of the culture change needed in the context of what could be a very bitter dispute if we get to that. So I think that there are good relations with the London FBU. I think ideally we won't get to the stage where we do have a strike in London, but we've got to be realistic about the need to plan for that. And obviously the cost of a strike, the daily cost of a strike is also quite significant. So we have been having initial discussions about that and with government, but we do need a national solution to this. This isn't necessarily something we can just resolve in London. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to pass to Assembly Member Hall to continue with some questions.
Thank you, Chairman. I am concerned about this because I know, particularly Andy, you've had a very good relationship with the London side, but I do know the Matt Rack, for instance. I mean, they hounded out one of the London reps who was quite senior because he voted for Brexit and supported Brexit. So they're very powerful within their own union, aren't they?
I think the relationship between regions and the national regions has been a matter of discussion both in this committee and obviously nationally previously. In some ways, I don't want to speak for colleagues in the FBU.
No.
What I'm focused on is maintaining a good relationship with the London region, who we've had a long and productive kind of set of professional settlements over everything from marauding terrorist attack to a completely different model of kind of high-rise firefighting, difficult issues. So I know that where we talk, we can come to a proper solution. My kind of focus is to steer clear of union politics and try and drive a bit of pragmatic common sense into the solution, because as I always remind the union, it's not in the interest of their members to go on strike. They both lose money.
Yeah.
It tarnishes our reputation.
Yeah.
And obviously, most obviously, it leaves London residents vulnerable. All I can do is speak for colleagues in the London region. They're cognizant of that. They don't want to strike either. How far we get in terms of negotiation is a complex mix of local relationships, national negotiations, and the willingness of all parties to find a solution.
So when you've discussed this with Matt Rack, obviously he must take London into account because it's 25%. I mean, how often have you discussed this with Matt Rack?
So I've not been able to talk to Matt about this directly. We have reached out to Matt, and I'll continue to do so. I would welcome, and I'm sure Matt may well watch this, I would welcome the opportunity to speak to Matt privately and hear his thoughts. I think that's important because I employ such a large section of the kind of fire service in the country. That channel of communication is always there, it's always open. We do have some contact with national officials. For example, Ricardo de la Torres is usefully coming to talk to us about culture. So I think the relationships are there to be built, and I would welcome that opportunity to discuss this because I have a particular concern, as Fiona has said, in the context of culture review and the damage it might do to go into a lengthy and bitter industrial dispute when we're trying to change, you know, the way we relate to each other inside the service.
Well, that's right. It's outrageous if he hasn't spoken to you, because if he takes them all into a strike, that's 25% of, I assume, his members. So, okay. And of course, the Independent Culture Review referred to a relationship framework between the LFB and the FBU, which at times has reinforced impatient, aggressive and hostile behaviours between the two. So, I think that will just cause even more problems. I'll move on, but I hope if anybody is watching from the union that they make sure that Matt Rack contacts you straight away. I think that's outrageous. Mostaque, if I can ask you, what previously agreed savings have subsequently been removed from 23-24, and is this indicative of a larger problem with the savings plan?
Thank you very much. I should kind of start by saying we carried out, in preparation for this round of budget planning, a comprehensive efficiency review, which is cross-departmental, looking at all areas of spend, getting ideas from our staff as well. And that's how we've been able to kind of set out in our plan efficient savings, not just for next year, but subsequent years, bearing in mind that, you know, we have to make sure we're kind of setting ourselves up for addressing the challenges over a longer period and a multi-year. And that has generated more savings overall than as the Commissioner said, in previous years. For me, it's absolutely right that we follow through on those plans. Overall, compared to where we were last year in terms of projecting to 23-24, we have more savings. There is one area where there has been a reduction for next year, but it's a rephasing of the savings, and that is to do with the people services savings area, where previously we had investment for restructuring and investment in systems. What the draft budget plan shows is that although we're still aiming to deliver the 1 million of promised savings from last year, it's been rephased or pushed out to a later year. That's partly due to a number of factors. One is some of those savings were predicated on having a new HR and payroll system, which has been delayed. Some of the restructuring of the team, for example, bringing on people, partners, and other restructuring has progressed slower than expected. I know there have been issues in the market in terms of recruitment. I've faced that in my own areas of procurement, for example. So that has been rephased. However, the Commissioner and I have been working with the people director in looking at how we can re-accelerate those savings into next year, more in line with the original plan. And that includes taking into account, clearly we have a report from the Culture Review, which also identifies a number of issues. So we are seriously looking at bringing forward those savings in line with the original plan, but having to clearly take into account the additional recommendations that come out of the Culture Review, which we have to, in my view, to make it sustainable, self-fund that from further efficiencies. So that's the area that has shifted, and we're looking to bring it back.
Okay, so will the proposal to re-establish a vacancy margin impact the level of overtime and operations in general? And if so, what will those financial implications be?
Sure. What I would say is for this financial year, we built into the budget an average vacancy margin, operation vacancy margin of 297. What we're proposing is, rather than completely eliminate that to zero in the next financial year, is to do it in a phased way. But we are going to be substantially reducing it to an average vacant margin of 100 next year, and then our aim is to 0 the following year. So rather than do it in one go, is to kind of phase it, and that's partly because it, there's a financial impact in terms of it's part of our overall making the kind of budget balance, but it's also to do with other factors that need to integrate with the establishment numbers, because the pressure on overtime, and I know, coming in when in June, that is one of the most important risks to the budget on an ongoing basis. It's been exacerbated by the summer heat wave. We also incurred a lot of overtime in relation to the death of the former Queen and Operation London Bridge. But even without that, there are some structural issues which we're trying to tackle, because of course the overtime, it's not just establishment numbers, it's also, for example, level of sickness, some of the overhang of leave that was stored up because of COVID and is now being taken up. It's how we do training and skills. So we have looked at this hard. We had an assistant commissioner dedicated to this, because it's really important, working with finance and people director colleagues, and we're developing a plan to really bear down on some of those structural issues, starting with, for example, watch-based training in January, which will really transform the way in which we have recall arrangements, because we need to resource to a level that ensures that we can meet the everyday kind of needs and demands of the fire service, but also be able to flex up when we have those additional surge in demand, and have a model that works better, that is, deal with operation risk, financially sustainable, and importantly as well, deals with well-being, because at the moment we are moving many of our staff from one, on standby moves all over the place. So
yeah, I know
that is absolutely top priority from a financial perspective, which we're working on at the moment.
Thank you. You mentioned training, Andy. How much of the how many officers, or what percentage of the workforce is training on a daily basis?
It varies on a day-to-day basis, but we can frequently send up to 110 people a day onto training courses, where we got ourselves to over a period of time because of inadequacies actually that were highlighted in the Grenfell Tower inquiry, was that we had to move to a model of individualised training allocation to ensure that people kept within legal boundaries of competency. So, for example, there's quite strict legislation that surrounds breathing apparatus wear. There's fairly strict kind of health and safety legislation that surrounds your ability to respond to a medical incident. Our older systems, simply when we were training people as a group, didn't allow us to keep up with that. We moved to an individualised training model. The knock-on of that was that we started to create a kind of fairly egregious overtime cost, because you were then sending, for example, 100 separate individuals from maybe 80 stations having to backfill. It's a completely incoherent system. That's getting stopped. So January, I've been told January the 3rd, we are flipping back to what we're calling a group-based training model, but with some very clear red flag checks and balances on ensuring individual competency is made. So a proper mop-up system. That immediately reduces the pre-arranged overtime bill, and because we've got a whole watch training together on their on-duty shift for an extended kind of period of time, means if there is a large incident, whether it's a terrorist attack, whether it's a wildfire, we can get them back because we know where they are. They're in the right operational formation. We stick them in a minibus, get them back to their fire station. So that's the sort of practical changes we're making with safeguards to ensure competency and reduce the overtime bill.
I get that, but the other elephant that's always been in the room is this is all daytime, isn't it?
No, we train on night times in a local model.
To what extent, though?
Every single night shift we will have people training.
All through the night?
No, because there are stand-down periods when people rest, because the physical demands on firefighters, and this is well evidenced, not just in LFB but throughout the entire sector, is that the physical demand of the job is that if you can get the option to rest at the point you are in between responding to incidents, then we should probably give that to you. And we're looking always at the kind of working routines and where we can maximise productivity, but there are good physiological reasons for enabling stand-down periods. A lot of this has been caught up in the mythology of beds, and I think an unhelpful narrative from both employers and union at times around this. The practical reality is that sleep hygiene is quite important when we're going to get you up at 2 o'clock in the morning, sometimes without any warning, to move heavy equipment, do something very physically exerting. The vast majority of firefighters, in my experience, do not sleep well on fire stations, having done years of it. You know, I was frequently out 6 or 7 times a night at Clerkenwell. Some of our quieter stations, maybe they won't so much. I fully acknowledge that.
Well, we know they don't. That's right.
But from my point of view, we need to maximise the hours we do have available outside of reasonable stand-down periods for training. We are continuously looking at that, both in the context of the contract and working routine. But I would want to be clear that I still think stand-down and rest periods are important.
Yes, I'm just looking at overtime in Q2 forecasts. You're due to overspend by nearly 10 million. If we get hikes in wages, that's going to put an even greater pressure on the system. I'm just thinking of ways that we could possibly deal with less people being off the run during a daytime period. And so, given that the strikes are about to happen, we might have to look at different ways of operating. That would make sense.
Well, I think that's what we've done with the proposals around training, because that is something we will have to consult on, because not everything in that will be comfortable from my colleagues in the union. The principle of recall is well judged, and we can demonstrate we meet our day-to-day requirements in terms of operational delivery with between about 80 to 90 appliances to maintain what are the best attendance times in the world, which is 6 and 8 minutes. But we need the full 142 appliances for a day like July the 19th, when we experienced a greater call rate than any other day we'd had since the Second World War. And we can point evidentially to time after time after time we've needed that, whether it's flooding, terrorist attack. So you do need that kind of strategic operational reserve to be immediately available. The way you get that is, rather than bringing lots of people in on overtime, which has been our previous model, and then separating out training as if these are people who don't exist, is literally just to flip that model, which is what we're doing in January, and that will bring a significant change to the way we calculate and use overtime. And we'll be looking at all the things we can to reduce that burden, because frankly our budget is predicated on reducing that bill.
Well, it's got to. It doesn't make sense to continue it the way it was. And I'm glad that in your beginning statement you had admitted that the budget last year was an absolute disaster. It was shocking, and I did say that to you at the time.
You did, Assembly Member Hall?
Yes, I did. So what is the anticipated additional cost to the LFC's budget of actioning the recommendations from the independent culture review?
So we haven't got a complete headline cost yet, and actually there may well even be efficiencies within it. So it's slightly more complex than just costs, because there will be both cost and efficiencies. We've accepted all the recommendations. We're working through the costings now. People are genuinely working on the sums now. We'd be very happy to write to this committee as that, you know, recognising the timing, as that detail emerges, with just complete transparency on what we think they are, both costs and efficiencies, because we think there's both within it.
Okay. I mean, have you already outsourced the complaints handling process?
Yes, we have.
So
that started last Monday.
Excellent. I'm pleased to hear that. And what's the cost of that?
Well, we've given ourselves a headline figure of around £500,000 that will take us up to six months. Takes us up 6 months. What I would say, though, is that by the end of January, we will have brought in an independent expert, you know, in kind of agreement with colleagues from the Greater London Authority, to do a whole-scale root and branch review of our human resource function, because we recognise that if we're making that investment, if we've put a function entirely outside the LFB, then you would need to question why we would be maintaining our current model of delivering a function of that nature. So there's fairly radical change potentially on the cards for the way we deliver our human resource function.
Yep. No, I appreciate that. One of the most striking anonymous comments from a respondent in the independent review was, I'm quoting, "I believe that some groups are allowed to get away with flawed behaviour due to a sense that it is easier to bypass them than take them on. This can be due to a mixture of union links, time in service, or knowing the right people." So do you hope an outsourced process will actually help with those issues?
Yes, because there's no internal relationship to muddy the waters. These are people who have no kind of context of networks or relationships within the London Fire Brigade, and therefore they're working on the basis of evidence. And I think that was one of the most significant learnings out of the report, is our processes simply had failed our people. Yep. That's it. And we shouldn't seek to excuse that, and therefore we had to do something radical, and we moved very quickly, obviously, to put those services externally of LFB.
Okay. Do you know yet the cost of the body-worn cameras?
We don't know the cost yet. We're exploring the most effective way to pilot and bring them into service. So obviously we've got big partnership bodies who use them, both TfL and policing. So we're going to both functional groups within the GLA to seek advice. I've got a director colleague who's taken this on in terms of ownership, who's speaking to Home Office officials around their experience, Network Rail. So we're looking at where we can piggyback off the kind of other people's procurement processes, because that makes sense, because obviously there's efficiencies of scale and the level to which, in terms of numbers, we need to bring it. Is it just for officers leading a crew, because we always work in crews generally, we're not lone workers. So all of that detail is being worked through, and again we would be able to incorporate that into the detail we give this committee if we write back around the costs.
Yeah, no, I thoroughly applaud that decision. It's really good. It's the right thing to do. Andy, what is the anticipated additional cost of a growing number of properties at risk of fire, and how is the LFC reflecting this increasing financial burden on its budget?
Are we talking about the? I'm presuming you mean the built environment.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, that is quite difficult to predict, because this is a kind of continuously unfolding picture. We know that there's a massive demand for inspection, so we're changing our inspection model to one that is really focused on the highest risk properties. Before, it was very much predicated on numbers, so the CRMP is really important, because we know we've got to do more with what is a limited national resource. We haven't got enough people qualified in the national system. We've just actually approved a fairly significant uplift in budget for fire safety. So have you got those figures, Mostaque? Are you able to? I think that was in the region of £637,000, which is taken from a direct grant at the moment from the Home Office, which we would seek to negotiate to ensure it's maintained, because we hold the greatest risk. We only have a vacancy margin at the moment for inspecting officer posts of about 10, with an overall staff level of 132. However, that's in constant flux, because we lose people into a very competitive market. We've built our own academy, which is why we're the most successful service in the country in terms of recruiting and maintaining those numbers. But of course, we've got 1,000 buildings on, simultaneous evacuation. We've got the most dense built environment in Europe, and we've got still in London, the most rapidly developing building sector in the country. All good for the economy, but with real challenges for us as a service. We've got the coming of the building safety regulator. It is still not entirely clear, I'm afraid, what impact that will have on us, but that means us hiring additional staff, because we need to support them with expert advice. So again, I think we could provide a more detailed written answer to you, but we're thinking about all of the impacts it might have. But we need clarity from both government, a new regulator, and to make sense of that in the context of what is a constantly shifting operational risk assessment.
Okay, I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Rogers.
Thank you, thank you, Chair. Andy, going back to the costs arising from the culture review, your sort of response says you're going to be taking a zero tolerance approach to discriminatory behaviour, which is absolutely the right thing to do. And any member of staff who's accused of these behaviours is going to be suspended. I just wonder whether you factored those potential costs into account, because judging by the report, there could be a lot of people suspended, including potentially whole watches. So there's going to be a significant overtime cost in covering those gaps. And I know you're already up against it with overtime. So how are you going to be covering those costs, and do you have an estimate of what those costs will be?
I don't think we can estimate the cost yet, because and this is a straight answer, until we see what the numbers are, to give you a sense of where we're at even at the end of this week. So if we take the external service, we've had 54 complaints into that service. We've already suspended 4 individuals at various levels of the organisation. There may well be associated costs with that, but I think I would be being disingenuous if I can give you an answer on that, because I don't know. I think it's very case dependent. But I suppose what I would say to the committee is if I have to suspend whole teams, I will suspend whole teams, and it will be worth the money if we get to a point where we eradicate what I think is a significant minority of people who absolutely undermine the general majority of people who just want to come to work, do a good job, and are decent, honest, hard-working, courageous public servants. But I'm afraid that behaviour just undermines our whole ethos. So I think you're right to, advise caution at the potential costs. We do worry, but I think we have no choice.
Yeah, and I mean, just to be clear, I absolutely welcome this approach. It's the right thing to do. But what I'm getting from your response is that this is going to be emerging, and you'll have to react rather than plan for it. Is that?
I think so, because again, we knew we had problems with our culture. I've been clear about it coming to this committee, other committees, for a period of time. Whilst we'd focused on the Grenfell Tower recommendations as the immediate priority in the first kind of 2 years of my tenure because of the immediate safety risk to Londoners, and obviously we've cleared 26 out of 29 of those, we always knew that culture was going to be the next big push, because if you again go back to my testimony in the inquiry, I'm clear that culture eats systems, culture breeds practices, so we had to get to the deeper lying issues. I've got to say that with Nazir having spent a year under the skin of the London Fire Brigade, it did expose problems that were beyond what I had expected. So I knew there were going to be, but the point of the review is to really bring that out in depth. In that context, I think we do have to see what emerges, because if 2,000 of our staff have effectively written that report and have spoken of such poor experiences at times, I think we have to anticipate a fairly significant impact in terms of what does emerge. I just can't put a number on it.
Okay, thanks, Deputy Mayor.
Assembly Member Pigeon.
I did want to come in on this point, if that's all right. There will be costs, and what I was going to say was when we get a better idea of this, I think that this committee and the FREP committee will want to get a sense of what those costs are. We are coming back, I think, to FREP on the 12th of January, so quite soon. So if we've got any more detail then, I think we'd be happy to talk about it. We've got another meeting with Nazir beginning of February, and then we've got the fire plenary. So I think we've got a number of occasions when the Assembly should be able to get more detail on that. I think that I'm pleased that the Commissioner has been able to take very firm action against the people who the service has sort of come to the conclusion there's enough grounds to suspend them. What I would say, though, is that there's also a benefit to some of these changes as well. I can't count the number of times we've had discussions about the levels of sickness because of stress, or why people might be leaving early. You've got a cost if people aren't staying in the job. You've got the cost of recruitment if people aren't retained. So I would like to think that we'll be able to demonstrate not just that the culture improves, but actually that there's a positive financial benefit to taking action, because it's defied us and it's defied understanding as to why people have been off sick to the level they have. When you read that report, it's no longer a surprise that you've got the levels of sickness, absence that the Brigade has had for many years. So I think that there will be a cost, but we're very hopeful that there'll also be a benefit, and we're happy to elaborate on that with this committee and with other committees and with the full Assembly as and when we have more detail. Thank you.
That's welcome. And of course, it's not just about cost either, but what we would need to hear and appreciate is going to be for future discussions is your plan to make sure that Londoners don't see a drop in service as well as a result of any suspensions. But thank you, Chair.
Yeah, actually, my point absolutely builds on what Assembly Member Rogers was just asking about, because I was wondering about additional recruitment costs that you're going to have to put into the budget, because you may well be losing a lot of staff one would hope if there are people already suspended and so on, they'll go through a process. You will be losing staff. But also, given what's come out, some people may be nervous about coming to work for you. You're going to have to work harder to find the right sort of people to come in. So are you building in that additional recruitment costs as well as these other costs of this process?
Both cost and change in process, because we've already seen an immediate impact in the shock of this report to kind of our outreach activities. So to be honest with you, one of the other reasons to commission this report is we've begun to very successfully recruit a much more diverse cadre of people into the brigade. If you think about the numbers we've brought to various committees, up around the 40th percentile for women, for black and Asian and other ethnic minority colleagues, absolutely pulling from the widest pool of talent in London. So that's great, but then they've got to land into an environment that really values and welcomes the difference. And I must say, I think we were starting to see some friction there in terms of some of the complaints that were coming into my office. So it's another important reason for the report. We've already seen just an immediate effect on people wanting to apply.
Oh, interesting. So
only in small numbers.
Yeah.
So we are going to have to work hard to regain trust. And I am clear that I think we need people to come in and be part of the change, but we have to demonstrate they're coming into a safe space. I'm not naive to that. So that is built in. What I would say is it's very easy, I think, with this report to focus on the most terrible examples of extreme behaviour, because they really were that. There was stuff I thought, we'd seen the end of in another era. Actually, I've gone out and I've spoken to over 400 firefighters this week. My other senior colleagues, in total, we've spoken to thousands of our staff, either in mass staff briefings, smaller group sessions. What is clear is the vast majority of staff want this. We are a bit rough around the edges. We are predominantly, a white male working class organisation, but I do not want to demonise all my staff. There are a lot of good people in there who also want this change and are willing to work with us. And I've been encouraged by the conversations we've had, because people have been open to the fact that no one's going to tolerate the worst examples. Part of addressing our culture is about dealing with those smaller underlying issues, the things that undermine people's feelings of being included, that are not necessarily intended, that people aren't even totally aware of. So it's got to be a kind of dual approach, one of both utter robustness with the worst behaviours, but actually a pragmatic and open kindness to having conversations with decent, long-serving, public service who maybe don't use the right language all the time, maybe are struggling with intergenerational differences of opinion. Well, both generations have got a value, so let's work with each other to kind of explore that openly. So that's really our approach. So whilst I think there is a risk of losing people with the worst aspects of behaviour, I need to be clear, that is a minority of staff. Where we see it, where we catch people, we will sack them. With the vast majority of staff, even where there's perhaps a bit of tension or challenge in teams or with individuals, we want to explore it first, and we want to give people the chance to change, improve, demonstrate their value.
Okay, but there's an investment here in terms of, your supervision, your management, which is common to the police. We talk about this all the time. And then we will expect, when you come up with more detail, a bigger number in terms of overtime, as Assemblymember Rogers has said, but also potentially in recruitment, additional costs in order to
I think it's a fair assumption. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
Assemblymember Hall.
Thank you. This just doesn't sit right with me somehow. You've got 2,000 people that have written your report, staggering some of the things in it. I can't believe this is just happening in London either. But you've got a very strong union, a really strong, one of the strongest unions in the country, the Fire Brigade Union. Why on earth have they not picked this up years ago and been screaming from the rooftop? And why on earth does the head of this, Matt Rack, not even engage with you? Why are they more concerned with going on strike than actually looking after their members as the years have gone by? And this just doesn't sit well with me. The unions should have been picking this up and really causing problems, countrywide, I would say. If they're, as I said to you, they hounded out one of your very good members in London. But I just don't understand how 2,000 people who should have been able to go to their unions and say, this isn't right, have had to come and fill into a culture review when suddenly it comes out. I thought obviously I've never belonged to a union, but I thought unions were there for you to go to for help.
They are, and people do, and the unions have been saying there's problems for a number of years, and I've started having meetings with the unions at the LFB where I have started by acknowledging that they've been raising some of these issues for years. And to be honest, the reason we've got 2,000 people coming forward was because Nazir engaged directly with the unions at the beginning, and they were so encouraged by the way in which he was going to approach this review that they encouraged their members to come forward. So I think that it's obviously the case that there will be union members who are being suspended, but equally the union has been highlighting some of the most egregious examples for some time, which is also clearly, I agree with you, it is their role.
Yeah, it's never come to FREP. It's never come to LFIPA. We've never seen anything like this officially as it is now, and I fear that it's countrywide, and I'm sad that the unions haven't sort of brought it to a higher level beforehand. I'll leave it at that because of time, but I just don't understand how, if things were that bad, and I understand they are, I'm not saying they're not, I just cannot understand, unless there are are there quite a few union members within the ones that are in trouble?
Yeah, inevitably, because we've got a 97% unionised operational workforce. To, again, be utterly objective in this, one of the reasons we commissioned this review was because of a number of very serious cases that the London region brought to me personally as Commissioner, both a group issue in the North East around leadership, which was proven and had to be resolved, and then some really depressing individual cases, including the alleged sexual assault of a female senior officer, a bullying complaint, again, involving different levels of leadership. Again, all credible cases, which I'm afraid our own internal processes had not satisfied, despite the union representing kind of both their members and indeed in the case of one complaint, people who weren't even their members. So I think I've got to be objective and give some credit to the London region that they were part of the genesis of this. What I would say on the other side of this is that I know, from the conversations I've had with London regional members, that they are grappling with their own issues in this area. And I can't speak for them, but I would hope that they would take the opportunity to come to a committee and talk about that, because I think it would do them some credit if they were able to be open about it, because I know they're grappling with it, because they recognise that their membership is our workforce. So if 2,000 of our staff have complained about an environment which is not right for them, invariably the union will have a part to play in this. What I would say to conclude, though, is that I'm absolutely clear that you create the conditions in terms of how you lead an organisation and how you work with, people who have an absolute right to be trade union members, to create the conditions of, culture and workforce you want. So I think part of the issues we've had historically in the London Fire Brigade is because I'm afraid senior leadership did not work appropriately within that industrial context and have a professional, balanced relationship with colleagues in the union. You kind of get the union you create to a degree. And I think the primary responsibility, and I own that responsibility, is on the leadership of the London Fire Brigade and the layers of leadership within it. Because if we get that right, then I can hold the union to proper account. At the moment, because of, I think, the criticisms inside that kind of leadership picture, I have to accept that change is needed by all parties to move this forward.
Thank you very much for that. And on that point, let's move on to the next section, which is Community Risk Management Plan, and it's Assembly Member Irani.
Thank you. Sorry, just recovering from the revelation that Assembly Member Hall has never been a member of a trade union. I wasn't expecting that. Just on the CRMP, you've already referred to it already, Commissioner, but last year you said one of the ways in which you could meet the future challenges around the financial environment is through the good planning in the CRMP. Can you explain what you meant by that?
By really laying out a clearly defined high-level strategic plan that anticipates the operational risks in London that are changing all the time, and then ensures we're committing the right resources to meet those challenges. I think it's pretty basic strategic planning stuff that we hadn't always perhaps done in that way previously. So it's about judicious use of resources set against emerging and changing risk at the highest possible level, and making sure that we stick to a plan and deliver it, on time in budget.
And in terms of budget, so can you give specific examples that could sort of help you identify savings in the longer term?
I can, because we've actually just gone through contemporary efficiencies round. So I'm going to come to my colleague Mostaque in a second. But I suppose at a principled level, just actually changing our structures. So the fact we've been able to come to this committee with a balanced budget is because we changed our internal governance. So we went from a place which was fairly archaic, which is where we only really considered budget in the context of the kind of regular meetings within the GLA's budget cycle, even internally, to now where we have a continuous kind of critical examination of our budget within a monthly finance and investment board. And I know that's not earth-shattering. I know lots of organisations have been doing that for a long time, but we just hadn't. So it's actually a structural approach, a continuous professional scepticism. So that is already delivering it. In terms of specifics, perhaps, Mostaque, you could roll out some of the things we've identified and are already taking action on.
Thank you, Commissioner. Yeah, so our budget plan for next year and the 2 years after that set out areas where we're already making changes in how we deliver to support the objectives. I mean, the CRMP sets out the framework and the strategy that we should be aiming for over the long term. And what we have been doing through all the work on efficiencies is how do we deliver that in the most effective and efficient way whilst protecting the front line. Absolutely, no reduction in operation firefighters, fire engines, or the number of stations. And within those constraints, there are opportunities. So an example in our budget submission is we've worked hard to identify how we, for example, deliver logistic support to a front line through what we call the Operations Support Unit, who provide vehicles and drivers. And at the moment, for example, a lot of those activities are done by frontline firefighters when actually they could be more effective doing actual firefighting, not really driving roles. So looking at the support we actually need. So a different model in that area we've estimated will deliver recurring annual savings going forward of at least £1.5 million, and that's been built into our budget submission. There are a number of other areas listed in Appendix 3, and we've also summarised the outcomes from our efficiency savings programme, which have specific tangible areas. What I would say, though, is this is not this can't be a one-off exercise. What I'm trying to do through the Investment and Finance Board, which is a relatively new board that was set up, and I chair, having kind of joined 6 months ago, is to take a more systematic approach to understanding our current spend, what we get from it, and actually what are some of the challenges that we project forward during the CRMP period, what are the new risks coming up, and how do we therefore find more efficient savings to free up the resources to be able to invest in those future and changing risks. And one of the approaches we're taking is to take what I call a thematic deep dive, take a chunk of spend, look at, so we started with IT, for example. We spend about £20 million on IT. We have over 100 staff in that area. And to look at kind of how is resource allocated, what are big contracts, what are the opportunities coming up, how can we do things differently? What are the new pressures on that department that the rest of the organisation is going to be requiring, given that tech is an area you have to keep investing? So how can we prioritise and look hard at whether we can have a line of sight from our expenditure to the CRMP priorities and if necessary, reallocate resources. So that's the kind of approach that we're doing, and the CRMP helps us to provide that kind of framework of what we're aiming for.
And so in terms of the CRMP, in terms of timelines, is it on track in terms of mayoral approval as well? I think the date of January 2023 was given in the paperwork. Are we expecting any surprises or any movement on that?
No, I'm pleased to say that the Mayor has been very supportive in this. It's been approved and it will launch as of the 1st of January, so that approval's been received just in the last week, actually.
Great. And in terms of the budget submission, it refers to the LFC using reserves to fund the CRMP. How will this money be used and what are the risks around this figure?
So I mean, as a general principle, I think, rightfully we've been criticised around our use of reserves previously, but that's really been focused on kind of inappropriate use of something like the budget flexibility reserves. I think reserves sometimes can be a bit of a misnomer. This is planned expenditure held within a ring-fenced kind of pot of money, so it's not kind of reckless dipping into reserves to deliver CRMP. Perhaps Mostaque, you can give an example of where we're going with that.
Sure, yeah. So I think one of the earmarked reserves, which is the category that the Commissioner was talking about, is we have a £1.9 million CRMP reserve. And clearly now that we have an approved CRMP, what the process will be going through is just to look at actually, and we're delivering in the early years of the CRMP period, like next year, we're already got a lot, existing money is being used to deliver the objectives in line with that. I think it's as we head further out toward the latter parts of the CRMP, where it's, we need to develop more of the costings as we get into the detail of the delivery and also the investment requirements. Our first look should always be whether we can deliver elements of CRMP from within existing budgets, but that 1.9 million reserve provides us an additional flexibility for over the investment requirements over and above our current BAU budgets. And the process we'll be going through that is we have now a rigorous kind of investment appraisal process. So any new proposals that want to draw down on that, we have through the investment in transformation, we have a more rigorous approach to portfolio and project management, all the kind of disciplines I've seen elsewhere. That's starting to take shape, where we assess the robustness of the business case, what returns we get, and the returns will be, some of it will be we would expect to be financial if we're investing a lot of money, but a lot of it will be what are the operational improvements we would expect to see if we're drawing down on this reserve, and so that it will be through that business case process that we have a control on use of that reserve, so that it's not a kind of free-for-all.
Thank you very much. Let's go to Assembly Member Pigeon.
Okay, I'm going to pick up some questions on the LFC transformation programme. Perhaps I could start with you, Baroness Twycross. What is your plan to manage the anticipated budget pressures arising from the work to respond to Grenfell Phase 2 report findings and recommendations?
We don't know yet what the Grenfell Tower inquiry will recommend in its final report. I think they've been working through getting recommendations in from interested parties, so I wouldn't want to speculate about what the total cost of this would be. I would expect more recommendations that are either directed at the Brigade or impact the Brigade's work, though. So it is the case that some of the issues that have been raised during the Phase 2 hearings have already been areas of focus of the Brigade's recent improvements. So we should be in a position where the Brigade is quite far advanced in delivering any new specific recommendations. So, for example, some of the issues that came up around training during the hearings, which were almost exactly a year ago now, and some of the other issues that I think the Commissioner may have more specific insight into. What I would say is that it's very important to remember that any improvements required to the wider building safety regime may have implications, both positive and negative, for Brigade resourcing. And even if these are aimed at government, it's the Brigade officers who are on the front line, for instance, in terms of auditing and inspecting buildings. So the resource implications of any changes to building safety regimes will have to be addressed by government, and we'll continue to press for being part of those discussions. And actually, I know that the Commissioner's had a number of really constructive conversations with government, not just recently in relation to pay, but over the last year or so in relation to building safety. But I can leave it to the Commissioner to say more on that, if that's helpful.
Yeah, but just saying there's nothing in this budget submission at all around the Phase 2 recommendations, but they clearly might have an impact. Have you...
Yeah, I think what we haven't done is go through and identify which ones are specifically related to recommendations that haven't been published yet, but maybe you can say a bit more on that, Commissioner. Thanks.
So obviously I'm not in a position where I can confirm the recommendations that are going to arise from Sir Martin Morbick's kind of inquiry process, but I think your question is fair, because obviously we've been part of both inquiry phases, and we are very much on top of the detail, and we can anticipate where there's likely to be pressure. What I would say is, even if we don't directly relate it in kind of format to the inquiry itself, it is incumbent within the CRMP process, because that CRMP process is basically built on a very, very detailed operational risk assessment, taking into account the learnings of the inquiry. So I think it's wrapped up in there.
So you
to
think
a
you've
great
covered
degree.
what you think
A
likely,
lot of it.
Yes.
A lot of it, but where there is uncertainty, it's back to the previous answer I gave around the role of the building safety regulator, some specific aspects of change which are as yet undetermined, for example, in relation to PEEPs, which could bring a kind of cost to us in terms of making sure that we're operationally fit to respond to the needs of the most vulnerable residents, for example, but they are difficult to anticipate until we see the end point of either legislation or recommendation. But I think they're built into that kind of revolving yearly plan approach within the CRMP, the kind of judicious holding back of reserves that might anticipate where emerging risk and therefore mitigation needs to be placed. And I think we've done a lot of the heavy lifting with Grenfell from phase one, because obviously we cleared 26 of the 29 recommendations which were focused on the biggest operational change and cost, whether it was kit, whether it was training, whether it was our policies. Actually, beyond that, it's probably in the fire safety regulatory area that phase two is most likely to impact us, and we just got to wait and see.
Okay, that's helpful. That's clear. And some stuff you've already got ongoing, which will pick up some of it. So that's clear. In terms of your transformation programme, and also it's a long time since I was really actively involved with the fire service, and I sat on LFEPA, so I feel slightly removed from this. But you've got this transformation programme, but it doesn't seem to be making as much progress to date as we would have hoped. So what steps are you taking, maybe to you?
I don't think that's a fair characterisation, to be frank, because if I look across the whole of government, we are the only body to have delivered almost in entirety the recommendations from the Grenfell Tower phase one inquiry. We've delivered the vast majority of the recommendations laid against us in the first round of inspection. We are already working our way through the second round. So, and we have evolved what was the historic transformation delivery plan into the yearly plan that sits within CRMP. I think we've moved massive change. But change is needed on a scale. Culture review points to that. So I don't think it's a matter of delay or holding back. I think it's about a big, old, creaking institution that needs change across almost every system and aspect of its delivery. And we are working our way through the priorities. We started with Grenfell because that was about the safety of hundreds of thousands of London residents. We've kind of got towards the end of that first phase. We will now turn ourselves inwards and look at those deeper-seated issues of process and culture. I think we're moving all the time. We've delivered a lot of stuff. Matt Parr, who came here to represent the inspector at one of the last FREPs, acknowledged that we're pretty good at motoring through kind of action plans for change. But what he wanted to see was a move from a kind of whack-a-mole delivery approach, as he put it, to getting into the more existential stuff, which I think this independent review gives us the leverage to do.
Okay, I'm going to come on to that cultural review in a minute. But what I want to pick up is, your budget submission states that you've been required to extend the implementation period of your transformation programme and reprofile associated funding from the year 22-23 to 23-24, which again suggests some slippage. I'm not knocking you have done stuff, but it sounds like there's some slippage. So what are you doing to make sure that there aren't further delays, and also that from that you can so this is budget committee, so thinking about the savings, efficiencies you can get from that.
No, that's a really fair challenge. There has been slippage in some aspects of what is a very wide-ranging and complex programme. In the context of public sector procurement, we had a legal challenge on one of our biggest spends around breathing apparatus, for example, to just stop the process.
Wow, okay.
But we've overcome that, and now we've had all the breathing apparatus sets delivered, and now we're in the process of training people. So one of the slippages you're referring to is that. We've had real challenges in procurement because we just couldn't recruit against a really competitive market for procurement professionals. Again, we've just overcome that. The inspectorate in its first inspection in 2019 was absolutely correct to criticise our approach to project management. We've effectively had to build a new architecture for project management from scratch, and we're only now in the process of being able to recruit those professionals in. 'Cause frankly, we need professional project managers to ensure we don't allow slippage. So we know where the issues are, we're addressing them. You're right to point to slippage, but I think they're built into our kind of projections and where we think there's both efficiencies and costs being extended. I mean, is there anything?
Sorry,
I'm so sorry.
Sorry, and then I'll pass over to Mostaque. I think that Andy's outlined a huge amount of transformation that's happened. I think just in my head trying to unpick the question, I think the main delay that is identified in the paper is probably relating to the fact that the new community risk management plan wasn't delivered on time, and so some of that rephasing is related to that. And I think that I have to say it was quite a hard lesson for the Brigade, because it basically led to a very damning inspection report in the summer. So I think that I'm confident that the hard lessons that were learned in relation to that slippage and the slippage in relation to the CRMP being published, and it is now on track to be published and sort of go live in January, that I'm confident, it's not that I'm not going to carry on sort of pushing them on this, but I'm confident that they've actually learned very much the hard way that you can do a whole load of good work, but actually if you don't have your key strategy in place, then there is going to be slippage. Thanks.
Okay, I must start.
Thank you. I was going to add, I think the Deputy Mayor has covered it, and that I think the budget report also talks about, specifically about that has meant a consequential rephasing of the transformation directorate team itself. Yeah. So the team that is developing new ways of working in terms of portfolio project management, and that's where some of the we've had to kind of phase some of the recruitment for partly the market issues, but partly to make sure we've got a kind of settled CRMP from which we can then prioritise the resourcing. So I think the comments were also linked to that in the submission.
And do you have set out what the timescales for the sort of key milestones in the delivery of the transformation? Is that something you can either tell us now or give us more detail?
We can provide you a detailed written response in, because we've absolutely got that.
Then we know what next year when you come back, and obviously I'm here, obviously Andy and Fiona more often, but Mostaque, you know, you're here, you're new in the role, talking a lot of sense in there, so to come back in a year's time to be able to say, and you have delivered, because it often feels, I feel like this with the police as well, every year we're asking the same things. And
I think, actually, in the context of the macroeconomics, which are placing such extraordinary pressures across the public sector, we haven't got any option other than to deliver. If we don't deliver, I don't pay my staff kind of the pay rise that we're likely to settle on out of negotiation. You know, we've made a 5% offer just to get to that 5%. We've had to achieve the budget savings that Mostaque's, described. So I think there may have been a point in the past where you were in an era where there was that latitude to slip. I don't see myself leading or operating in that context, because I do not think there is a macroeconomic environment that can possibly support that.
Okay, and finally, Deputy Mayor, let me come to you. The independent culture review, which we've already talked about today, does it risk creating further complications to this whole transformation programme as you consider how you're going to implement it, or how are you managing that risk in terms of the timescales again?
So I think that without the understanding that the independent culture review gave us, I think that actually the transformation programme would have probably failed, because it really, just going back to my comments about sort of, it helps us understand why people were off sick, which is a question that's come up a lot. So it's helped us understand why maybe there's a resistance, or that there's a failure for that whole big message about transformation to get down to other layers of the organisation. So it's portrayed as something that the very senior leadership sort of aspire to, but actually that understanding about the transformation process and what that means for the organisation hasn't gone down to other levels within the organisation. So there's that sort of failure to actually sort of communicate the internal comms piece that comes through as something that requires improvement from the independent culture review. So actually, I think that It may mean that we have to look a bit at making sure that we've got the right things in place within the transformation programme. You can't separate out the independent country review from transformation. I think the independent review only happened because we started talking about transformation and the need for the brigade to change in the context of a very tragic death of a young firefighter. So I think that that's not to say that we're going to say, yeah, go away, rewrite it all and sort of come up with different timescales, but we will be testing the assumptions within the existing plan to make sure that they're fit for purpose. And I think that that's something that we'd be keen to explore further with the Fire Resilience Emergency Planning Committee when we come back, when we've worked through some of that a bit more.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Okay, any more questions on this section?
I do, but can I put them in writing? I'm mindful of the time, so
Okay,
I do.
for that. Any more? Let's move on then. And you'll be up to on the last leg. So we'll get through this. So, Susan, do you want to begin?
Yep, I'll be quick, and then anything else we can put through in writing, if that's all right. I'm mindful of the time. Andy, what's causing the delays to the delivery of the LFC's capital programme 22-23, and what is being done to address the challenges? So we're on capital delivery and reserves.
Yeah, that's an entirely fair challenge, and I'm going to pass to my colleague Mostaque, who has the detail to answer it.
You don't like that one.
No, it's a good question.
So in the time I've been here, I've looked at what's been happening both this year and previous trends, and I think there's a number of factors which we have to kind of tackle. So one is, and I've seen it elsewhere in the public sector, I think in terms of the planning and the budgeting, there is over-optimism. People always assume that they can deliver more quickly than they actually do. That's been exacerbated clearly in recent times by the market inflation, supply chain issues which you've seen in a number of our areas, both, for example, in fleet, equipment, IT and other areas. I think it's also fair to say, historically, when setting some of the budget and profile of capital spend linked to the optimism, that test of the realism of the delivery, what's being held as contingency, how risks are managed, some of those principles of good things I've seen elsewhere. We're starting to introduce them, but we're dealing with a backlog. It's also the case that with our capital programme, we didn't always start from a position of knowing the conditions of our assets well and that forward planning. So if I take property, what we have done now is, and they started before I came, it's been completed while I was here, is a really good data on the condition of our overall estate and kind of rag rated and what's really red risk, urgent priority, what's slower time. That has now enabled us to develop a forward programme of capital investment, which is multi-year, which has then allowed us to plan our procurement frameworks in a more forward-looking way, rather than, for each kind of building trying to develop a new, looking at procurement in a singular way, use the frameworks. I think those are the kinds of things, as well as I've talked about the more rigorous approach to project and program management disciplines, which really test and assure the delivery confidence. I think all of those things will make a difference, but they haven't been there, and therefore we have seen this year a very significant capital underspend, and that's something absolutely we need to kind of avoid. I have a lot more confidence that because of all the things we're doing, we will improve it. Can I be absolutely sure that we won't get capital? There will always be uncertainties, but I think we must do much better at this.
Well, I'll absolutely echo that. Very significant issues there. Andy, well, I don't know, having listened to Mr. Ahmed's comment, how can you reassure the committee that you will deliver your capital programme on time, given the delays experienced this year? I think you'd be foolish to say that you can assure us, given what's just been said.
In almost kind of any answer in this area, I wouldn't want to give complete assurance anyway, because of the macroeconomics.
We wouldn't believe you.
No, possibly not. I suppose it's what I've said in previous committees, which is, I've always been in a position, whether I sat in a public inquiry or in front of one of these committees, where I need to be judged on delivery. So what I say now is that I've got far greater confidence because of all the other kind of responses we've given around fundamentals, a different approach to it, a completely different set of structures to kind of judge progress, because again we just didn't come back to it often enough. Whereas again, if we've got a finance and investment board that is looking at this on a monthly basis, you not only change the structure and process to give yourself more confidence, you start to change the culture, because people know that they're under constant scrutiny. It starts to change the way people think about this and the way they're judged in terms of their own performance to manage what is a very significant amount of public money. So, more confidence won't give you complete assurance. Expect to be judged to hard account on delivery.
You'd like to think so, but as Assemblymember Pigeon said, the times we come back, particularly to policing and fire, and ask the same questions every year. We've just been through 2 hours previously with our police colleagues, same questions and no answers. So we're a bit weary of it even today. Am I doing the Albert embankment? No, you're Assemblymember.
It's Assemblymember Pigeon.
Yeah, 8 Albert embankment. I mean, ever since I have been involved with the GLA, it has been up for disposal, to be redeveloped and so on, and every plan seems to fail, come up with opposition. Where are you with it? Are you just going to dispose of it? What are your plans?
No, and actually this is entirely serious. I'm in a position where we need to make a decision in London about the balance between affordable housing, which I absolutely get must be a priority for Londoners. We need safe, affordable housing for Londoners, if you think about the, kind of the crisis in available housing. But I'm afraid there is nowhere else for this station. And it is one of the most significantly strategically important fire stations in London. It is one of the few remaining that responds directly into the government security zone. It serves one of the poorest and most densely populated places in the UK. There is nowhere else for it. We cannot find anywhere else for it. We have looked. What has held us up is not actually the LFB's willingness to redevelop the site, think imaginatively, work in private-public partnership, which is the most sensible way to do it on a very high-value site, but is actually the realities of the planning challenge in London, understandable local opposition, but in the end, we have to make a decision for the greater good. I'm in a place as Commissioner now where I think we've reached the end of the road here, because I have a building that otherwise I will have to invest very significant capital funds to keep standing. So what I ask for from all parties in this, whether community, local authority, central government, colleagues in the GLA, is a pragmatic understanding of what happens if we don't have that asset there. Because I'm at a point where London Fire Commissioner where I answer to that, and I want that station rebuilt. I need it rebuilt. There is a plan. We're working our way through it, but that's kind of the point I'm at, because I've also witnessed nearly 15 years of failure on that site.
Completely. Okay, so you've got a new plan being developed. When do we expect to see? What are the timescales for that?
I can't give you a definite, because whilst we have plans, it is about the external kind of challenges of the planning system, both in terms of legal, contractual, local understanding of a newly developed plan, the willingness of a developer to continue a relationship with us after so many years of trying to move progress on the site. Real challenges. So I can't provide an absolute in that. It's, it is progressing, but please, perhaps Mostaque, if you've got anything
further. Fresh to this.
Sure, yes. Another one I've been looking hard at. The revised proposals, which are still in development, takes into account the main objections from the last failed planning round, so the kind of particular 2,000 in the middle. So we clearly have to listen and take account of that, otherwise we'll fail again.
Yes,
no use kind of going in with trying the same thing again. But that has to balance with actually a commercially viable, because we're trying to deliver on a number of multiple objectives here. One is it's a valuable public asset, and the taxpayer should get something from it. Clearly, we need operationally, the LFB needs a fire station. Clearly, there are opportunities for affordable housing and those targets. Also recognising, in terms of commercial viability, the market is not what it was when we originally had it, so it's got to be that's got to be factored in. Some of the grant funding from our original Housing Infrastructure Fund is not necessarily guaranteed now. So that is the challenge we're trying to work through with colleagues in GLA, the local council, trying to find a way through all of that. So it's not going to be easy, but we do have some draft proposals. Yeah. Clearly, ultimately, if we manage to have something that is viable, it will go through the usual public consultation
yes, of course.
Process.
But you're looking to listen to what happened with planning to come up with something that has a hope of getting
absolutely.
through.
We can't go in
and
with
it
the
may
same
be
thing.
more private housing or office accommodation or whatever on it, or something to make it stack up. Which, yeah. Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Sorry.
Chairman, I was coming in with the next, but I've got other questions on there. Would you rather it was put in writing? Because I do want answers to these.
It was...
oh, you were coming in, Anne.
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
It's
I've got
okay.
me written by that
Sorry.
one. We're all over the place.
So,
Take that notice.
Assembly Member Clark.
Yeah, thanks. Staying with that theme, Andy, I'm just wondering, how are you ensuring that you will be able to replenish the budget flexibility reserve?
Again, this is one for Mostaque, so
Yeah.
Mostaque, if you wouldn't mind, please.
Yes, so our 3-year plan...
Can you turn your microphone on? Sorry.
Thank you. Our 3-year plan in the budget document sets out that for next year, 23-24, as the Commissioner said in his opening statement, that we do use 4 million of budget flexibility reserve for that year only to deal with the exceptional inflationary pressures across a number of energy and other contractual positions that we have. But that is only for that year, because by the time we get to year 3, because of the rolling program of savings and efficiencies, we actually pay that back in 25-26. So that is our plan, to use it when in a year where we had multiple challenges. We had the 11 million funding gap, we had extra pay that wasn't budgeted, all those things where we have to make use of it. But as we have implement our rolling program of efficiencies, by year 3 we can replenish it.
I mean, but that's going to assume that sort of inflation does come down, and what are your feelings if we remain in a financially difficult place?
Sure. And we've taken on board the latest projections from the Independent Office Budget, where they say next year clearly inflation is still high. It goes down from a peak if you believe the forecast, and then it keeps going down. But we can't guarantee that. So that in terms of the risk to our budget, I've mentioned earlier, kind of pre-range over time. I'd say pay and inflation are key risks and uncertainties. The budget flexibility reserve was set up to deal with those uncertain times, so we are using it appropriately, but we want it to be the last resort rather than the first resort. Hence the programme of being as efficient and find the savings as much as possible, and only will go to the budget flexibility as a last resort.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm going to hand over back to the chair, but I think Enver has some questions.
Yes, Assembly Member Desai, very quickly.
Very quickly, Chair. Just going back to the delays to the delivery of the capital programme, and my question is to you, Mostaque. Now, very briefly, conscious of the time, but a lot of these delays are due to global supply issues, things that are obviously beyond your control. Can you give us an example of those sort of things that are beyond your control, and of course delays to the capital delivery programme?
An example would be clearly one of the priorities arising from the various recommendations that the Commission talked about was, for example, respiratory and protective equipment and radios. These are kind of quite specialist areas, and breathing apparatus, where there are few suppliers, and actually some of the suppliers are overseas, so there is a kind of supply chain impact on that. Another example would be we had a project to redevelop kind of upgrade kind of Plumstead Fire Station, and we had some indicative budget figures, but since those plans were developed, clearly the market inflation in the property sector and construction has rocketed. So therefore, we've had to renegotiate with the supplier on that, and that causes delays, because then you're re-looking at your kind of procurement and contract, whether you go out again. So these are some of the examples that we are facing in this turbulent market.
Conscious of the time, perhaps you could write to the committee with examples of things that are under your control, so to speak, and things that are beyond your control, like global supply issues.
Thank you very much. Let's move on to Assembly Member Russell for the final set of questions.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning, everyone. I want to start by saying what an absolute pleasure it was reading the climate budget narrative in your document. But not only that, it was seeing that there were climate risks and climate issues peppered through the whole of the document. So it shows that as an organisation, you really get the way that the climate budgeting process can actually be helpful in terms of saving money and addressing risks that the Brigade faces. So I just wanted to put that on record, because it, you know, I'm looking at these climate budgets on from each part of the GLA, and this was it was an absolute pleasure to read. It's really thorough, creative, and very thoughtful. So, yeah, just bask in that for a moment.
But not for too long.
Well, it's
but
not
for
not
too
that
long,
common
because
a
otherwise the
moment,
chair's
to be fair,
going to shut me up.
Thank you.
So when I was questioning the police commissioner just earlier, I raised the issue that the GLA's PPA power purchase agreements have been delayed. And I just wondered sort of if you could talk about how you are sort of hedging those risks of kind of putting all your eggs in one basket, and what you're doing to try and make sure that you're not reliant on one element of your plans.
I mean, I think I'd go even a step back. I think the reason we've come at this with an energy is because really firefighters, more than any other emergency service, end up in a very high-risk situation when you begin to understand the possible end result of climate change. So if I look at what I think were some of the most dangerous fire conditions I've seen personally in the summer, you know, that was a fairly shocking set of occurrences. And I know there's a big debate in terms of, you know, the timescales and impact of climate change, but that was just a very real example of firefighters experiencing that. So we know that if we don't contribute, we're, in the end, as part of that bigger existential issue, putting firefighters at risk. So if you want to talk about big risk, it's the 5,000 calls we got in one afternoon to flooding in 2021. We know that this is one of our most significant risks in London. The kind of growing evidence across a number of years shows that in terms of events. The second part of it is if you want to talk about investment and mitigation of future cost, we know that with an ageing estate, that if we don't replace infrastructure with things that balance the types of energy supply we're using, we're going to get caught out by everything from rising gas prices to a lack of electrical infrastructure, which is seeking to put in all in one go when we have one of the largest HGV fleets in London that we know inevitably, because of the arc of history and where technology is going, will one day no doubt be hybrid or electric. So I think we're challenging ourselves in every area, which is wherever possible, we procure now for next generation equipment. So, for example, gas boilers. We've got a lot of gas boilers on fire stations. Clearly, wherever possible, you need to replace them with air source heat pumps, with, you know, ground source heat pumps, where it makes sense in the building, or solar panels on the roof. We've got 103 fire stations. So we're trying to hedge our bets with a mixture of self-sufficiency, cleaner technology, which gives us a more sustained kind of approach moving forward in terms of challenges around energy supply. You know, getting into the competitive environment of trying to secure energy supply. There's going to be a challenge. Everyone's trying to green themselves in London, and we've got an electrical infrastructure that needs replacing if we want to charge a big vehicle fleet. Notwithstanding all of that kind of positivity and the kind of creativity I think we are bringing to it, and we've got a good team there, there are some real challenges. Headline figure for really taking us towards carbon net zero is £240 million because of the size of our fleet and estate particularly. We will need to work with colleagues in the Greater London Authority to think, you know, in a creative way about how we access that, because much like colleagues in policing, we will not touch our operational delivery to do so, particularly in the face of that perhaps bigger existential threat. But I am encouraged by the discussions we've had with both kind of central government and particularly colleagues in the GLA as to how we're kind of starting to approach that. So that gives you the sort of headline. I mean, Mostaque probably has details of the sort of boiler replacement programme and some of the things we're doing, but
perhaps in terms of the boiler replacement programme, if you've got details on that, it would be really interesting to have them. But if you could write to us with those details, that would be fantastic. Just in terms of, you've got a zero emission pumping appliance project, I understand, which sounds amazing. It might be worth looking at what they're doing in Islington in terms of retrofitting refuse vehicle collection vehicles, which are also very big, heavy vehicles. There may be some crossover and learning.
We've looked across sectors with that. I mean, I can give you a bit of detail. The issue with fire appliances is not getting them to the incident. It's the charging time and the fact you have to pump water for a very extended period of time. So the technology that is kind of manifest in that zero emission pumping appliance, so that's working. We've got the trial model. It's out there doing road tests and operational tests. It is there. It's more about cost because we're moving in advance of most of the rest of the world. That's the first one in the world actually in terms of entirely kind of electric with only a petrol motor for emergencies. There are challenges of that. The real challenge isn't the fleet actually, it's the available electrical infrastructure in London because a lot of our fire stations have effectively an enhanced domestic supply. When you start putting lorries that need charging into them,
it's not going to work.
So we've got to think imaginatively. You know, it might be a phased approach. It might be that we run our current fleet on biodiesel for a few years. You know, that could happen now if you're looking at rising kind of DERV prices. So we're thinking, I think, across the range of practical possibilities to keep moving in the right direction.
Now, picking up on practical possibilities, one of the examples of text in the main body of the budget under capital strategy that relates to this climate agenda, it says fire stations operating 24/7, making major refurbishments and extensions, making major refurbishments and extensions difficult to undertake while operational cover is maintained. And this coupled with a lack of suitable and affordable sites for fire stations to operate on from a temporary basis while any of those works are undertaken. So you've noted those challenges of retrofitting your existing buildings with new heating and everything else you need, sort of while you're keeping them operational. Do you think this is how are you addressing those risks to meeting your 2030 goal?
Careful site-specific planning. That's the only way you can do because we're bad neighbours. So I think there's you know, very often I get challenged with why don't you build more housing? Why don't you collaborate on your sites? Why don't you do it a different way? The reality is we need big yards to train in. We make a lot of noise. We're in and out the doors the whole time. And we're very location dependent on maintaining those instant response times. So the answer is basically we have to plan it on a detailed kind of case-by-case basis set against the capital plan for refurbishment and you know, a well in advance approach to decanting really important operational assets. We've done it multiple times before, so I think we're quite good at it because we do refurbish fire stations and then we move them either to a neighbouring station or onto a third-party site where we have to. So we've got a long history of successfully doing that. I don't anticipate that changing actually.
And just finally, the pre-arranged overtime sort of pressures on the budget, which you know, were related very specifically in the summer, as you mentioned at the beginning, to that very extreme day of those 40-degree heat and extreme wildfires and real pressure on every part of the brigade operation. Are you allocating specific resource going forward to manage those kind of impacts? And the same goes with extreme rainfall and sudden surface water flooding?
It's built into the CRMP really because everything is driven through that operational risk assessment. I was a national flood rescue advisor, so I deployed out of London in 2013, 14 and 15, all over the place, Somerset Levels, Cumbria. We've gone from a position where you could genuinely talk about 1 in 100-year events. They're now 1 in 2-year events. So we've seen it in the service nationally. It's one of the key priorities in the National Fire Chiefs Council as well. So all our operational planning is predicated on a greater demand across the whole year actually, in terms of a greater draw on our resources in climate-related extreme weather events, particularly because we've got repeated evidence of that happening. it drives actually part of our approach to reducing pre-arranged overtime, because there isn't, you know, there's no good reason to have all 142 pumps immediately available all the time and using your pre-arranged overtime that way. But you do need that strategic reserve, which will probably off training, to be called back almost immediately, so they can come in as a second wave or they respond to a catastrophic event, whether it's terrorism, whether it's a very large high-rise fire, whether it's wildfires. So the answer we gave previously around, for example, watch-based training is how we're dealing with that. The two things are symbiotic. That's how we're planning in that context.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, so there's no further questions. Can I thank you for the way that you answered the questions this morning, and thank you for your attendance. We're going to now just tidy up some business, and you're free to go, but we've just got to continue.
Thank you, Chair. Assembly members, thank you.
Can I ask the committee to note the reports and discussions? No. Can we delegate authority to the chairman in consultation with party group leaders to agree the outputs arising from the meeting? Agreed. Okay, moving on to item 5, budget and performance work programme. Can we note the committee's work programme for 2022/23? Okay, the date of the next meeting will be held on the 4th of January 2023 at 10 a.m. in the chamber. Moving on to item 7. I have no urgent business today, so that concludes today's meeting. Thank you very much.